When we are young, all of us want to change the world. Some of us want to do it when we are older also, but the young have more energy and passion. Too often, though, this energy and passion has nowhere to go. In a worst case situation, we may end up posturing on social media, imagining that the more virtue we signal, the more virtue we possess. I have no time for a person who does this and this alone. My heroes are all people with a bias for action. They see a hole in the world and they rush to fill it. They don't pontificate, they do. And from their doing, they learn. And then they do better, and then they learn again, and so on in a virtuous cycle that ensures that anyone who wants to make a world a better place will succeed if they just keep doing. My guest today came back to India from a big American university at the age of 18 because she saw children at a traffic signal and decided to try and make a difference to their lives. She got to work educating kids in slums, built an acclaimed educational organization called the Akanksha Foundation, decided she wanted to do even more at scale, built another iconic institution called Teach for India, and has spent her life so far working and learning, working and learning, working and learning. Be like her. This is a life to live.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Shaheen Mistri, founder of the Akanksha Foundation and the CEO of Teach for India. I don't imagine these organizations need any introduction, and anyway, you will hear all about them in the course of this conversation, where we discuss Shaheen's journey, what she learned about education, what she learned about our society, and how she ignored conventional wisdom time and again to do what she felt was right. Much to be inspired by her, but first, let's take a quick commercial break. Many of the things I have learned in my life, I had to learn on my own. I think you'll agree with me that our education system doesn't teach us so many things that we need to make the most of ourselves in this world. I learned my lessons when life happened to me and I happened to be paying attention. For many years now, I've been thinking, what are the essential life lessons that everyone should learn to be able to live a complete life? I invited my friend Ajay Shah to join me on the intellectual challenge of figuring this out, and then we decided to put together a course where we would actually teach this stuff. So we created Life Lessons, which you can check out at lifelessons.co.in. In this 5-week course running across 5 Saturdays, we have put together 15 webinars that are intended to help launch you down journeys of discovery. We will speak about learning how to learn, learning how to think, mindsets, mental models, clear writing, how to communicate better, quantitative intuition, probabilistic thinking, the history of thought, the foundations of economics, and even practical matters like how to think about personal finance and how to think about personal health. People who do the course also get to be part of a larger community that will have in-person meetups once a year. Basically, while we've always been sharing what we have learned in a piecemeal way in our show and our writings, here and there, diffused, this is an effort to synthesize our knowledge for you. So please head on over to check out Life Lessons at lifelessons.co.in. Never stop learning. Shaheen, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you.
Before we start talking about your journey and your work, what else do you do besides what people know you for? Like, people know you for Akanksha, Teach for India, but what else do you do? Like, as a kid, I know you learned piano for 10 years and so on, but otherwise the work that you do must be incredibly immersive. So how do you spend your time? What do you read? Do you still play the piano? What are you outside of your work?
Yeah, I do still play the piano. I actually stopped for a while and then picked it up again. I am a musical junkie, so I watch every Broadway musical that I can. Most recently, just saw Phantom a couple of days ago. I love animals. We have 2 dogs at home, and so I think the one big choice point in my life was children or animals. So that's how much I love animals. I paint. So I started painting just before COVID. Yeah, really love painting. I love music. I watch a lot of movies. I read books. So yeah, quite a lot of stuff. Yeah.
Let's go back to your childhood. I'm fascinated by your growing up because you went to 10 schools across 5 countries. You had a life of travel, a pretty plush life. In your book you talk about the sort of the texture of your life: tennis lessons, school projects. You played a role in the Wizard of Oz. You've described the food also: the souffles, the chicken curry, the hummus, the egg white desserts, the meringues, etc., etc. All the vacations that you took. Tell me a bit about that childhood, and what was your conception of the world, and what was your conception of India growing up, because you were traveling so much, and you'd probably have seen a very cosseted, sort of privileged life at that point.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like a life is such a long, long time. When I think about myself as a child, I think I grew up with a lot of privilege. I think I was quite spoilt, very lucky, very blessed, had a very supportive family, lots of experiences at school, tried a lot of things, gave up on a lot of things as well. I think I had the privilege to be able to do that. I think I started and stopped ballet. I started piano and, maintained that for a while and then stopped that as well. I think we had a lot of beautiful times traveling. So both lived in many countries, but then also managed to spend vacations traveling. So grew up, I think, exposed to many different types of people. Mum was also a speech therapist at the time. And so we had a lot of children in and out of our home. She used to do her therapy sessions at home. Dad used to travel a lot, but was quite strict. So we grew up, me and my brother, with quite a lot of discipline as well. We would, on Sunday mornings, he would already have done 6 things by 9 a.m. So grew up with discipline. Was also a very, very shy child. So even this conversation, will take me a little bit of time, to warm up. I was that kid in class that would dread the teacher calling on me. And I would just be framing my answer in my head again and again. So, I think I grew up shy. I grew up also quite in awe of my brother, who I felt he was 2 years younger than me, but I felt way more talented than me. So he played the violin, I played the piano, but he ended up performing at Carnegie Hall. I never got anywhere close to that. So yeah, it was a medley of lots of people in and out of our home. My mom especially has a way of drawing lots of people into her life, lots of art, lots of culture, lots of different types of food. We used to celebrate Christmas, grew up without any real roots to India, interestingly, maybe because of our Parsi also heritage. So everything Western was sort of looked up upon. I remember not fitting in too well, especially in my high school, wanting to be more American. So yeah, it feels like a very different person who I was growing up and who I feel I am today. Yeah.
I want to ask both about your mom and your dad individually. Like, one little detail about your mom that I'm fascinated by is that she set up the Education, Audiology and Research School, Mumbai's first school for the hearing impaired, when she was in her early 20s.
Yeah.
So when one first reads about you that you're starting Akanksha at 18, you're like, my God, that's crazy. Why would someone start something at 18? But then your mom started something in her early 20s, and your mom always had these kids coming in and out of the house. And, you've described elsewhere about how you would find her so patient with the kids, knowing exactly how to deal with them, and etc., etc. So tell me, let's go into what you saw of them and all the unconscious ways in which they influenced you, because kids don't really learn from what their parents say, they learn from what their parents do. So tell me more about your mom. What kind of person was she? What did you know about her?
Yeah. And I think the story goes back even further to her mom, my nanny, who was a huge, I think, influence both on her and on me. But mom, I think mom continues to influence me in multiple ways. I think the most the quality that stands out the most is her energy. She still today in her 80s has like 3 times the energy that I have. So she's out morning till evening. She sits on multiple boards. She volunteers in different places still today. So she's always had the orientation to serve, to care. Today there isn't a day when she isn't visiting like 3 people in hospital, doing something for some nonprofit. So that's a big part of what I think has shaped me, just the idea of service and children. I think the second is just her creativity. She's a beautiful writer. She's written multiple books, but also just for family occasions was always putting together a little book for my daughter or a book for me or a poem for somebody else. And so just her spirit and her imagination and her creativity, I think that was, and has been a big influence for me. I think the third is she just like sees the world in a very positive way. Actually, for many years, I didn't quite understand that. I thought like maybe she's a little bit naive. Like, we would have the same meeting with somebody and I would walk out with many questions about the person, but she would only be able to focus on the good, until I realized over time that it was actually a conscious choice and she was choosing to see the good in people, the good in the world, and actually focus on that. So I think her positivity and optimism has been a big source of inspiration for me. And just her ability to be herself with so many different people, which I still aspire to be more like that. But my mom can really enjoy herself in any situation she feels comfortable. And I think that's been really beautiful. Should I talk about my dad?
Sure.
So dad and mom are very different from each other, I think, and I've learned very different and I think somewhat complementary things from both of them. So from dad, I think I really learned just drive and focus. I think my dad just always put his head down and tried to do whatever he was doing really, really well, almost like obsessively well, right? So whether it was like playing the violin, just the meticulous way he would break it down and practice. And we grew up with this practice makes perfect being said by my dad again and again, just practice makes perfect. So I think he showed me the value of practice. He showed me the value of like learning things really well, and had a career also that was pretty single-minded, like in the bank for many, many years. So just putting his head down and doing what was well. I think I also learned a lot of courage from my dad. They were in Riyadh during the war, and he chose like not to leave and to be there and to show that he would stay there. They were also in Beirut during the war. So they've lived through some difficult times, but I think dad was always very resolute, very courageous. I think the other thing that stands out about my dad is just like real generosity towards family. He's looked after most of our family at some point or the other in many ways. Got a very soft heart. He was quite strict with us growing up, but really like the most kind and gentle heart. So yeah, I grew up with a lot of positive influences between both of them.
And when you were growing up, like, what did you think that you would do later in life? You've already spoken about how you'd flit from one thing to the other, started the ballet, gave up the ballet.
Yeah.
You were learning the piano. How did you see yourself? I know it's, premature to talk of someone who is still in her teens, having concrete dreams for the future. But what was the story you were telling yourself about yourself and the things that you would like to do or the kind of person you were?
Yeah. So I actually think I had a fair amount of clarity very early on that I wanted to do something that would leave like a positive impact in the world. Actually, at 12, I have a diary entry where I used to write poetry, and I would sit in my garden in Indonesia and write. I had the diary was named Beth also for some reason. I don't remember why, but I remember writing at 12 that I believed that little things could make a really big difference, and I was here to do something that would make the world better. So that's one recollection I have. I also, from the age of, again, 12, every summer I would choose to volunteer. And I ended up volunteering in a range of different organizations with children, but always with kids who had some kind of need that was special. So I worked in an orphanage one summer. I worked with autistic teenage boys one summer in New York. I worked with the visually impaired on trips back to Mumbai. So a lot of those, I think, volunteering experiences, I think, really shaped what I do as well. And I found very early on that my happiest space was with children and with animals. So animals was more on the personal side. So my brother and I in Indonesia actually had a clubhouse, which we put up signs that said no adults allowed. And we would pick up stray animals from the road and sort of nurse them back to health and find homes for them and keep them in this clubhouse. So, I ended up having a lot of very interesting animals. The most interesting was in Indonesia, there was a terrible market where they would sell wild animals. And I saw a slow loris, which is sort of a mix between a raccoon and a monkey, being very badly treated, and brought it home, built sort of this enclosure around a big tree in our garden. So right from slow lorises to fruit bats to a Norwegian rat. I mean, I had all kinds of different animals growing up as well.
Did you have any heroes in terms of, when you thought about making the world a better place? Did you have any models or heroes that you could look up to? What did you daydream about, if there was anything concrete, and, how you wanted to do the stuff you wanted to do?
I never thought that much about the future growing up. I also don't remember having any concrete role models. I think I drew a lot of inspiration from just the everyday people around me. So we had a Indonesian teacher who taught my mom Bahasa, who I was very inspired by. We had people who worked with us at home who I was deeply inspired by. I had one teacher in school who was my zoology professor, Mr. Kachuba, who used to in the summers work directly with Siberian tigers and was also part of a rock band. And I remember being very influenced by that teachers who just teach, I felt had less to offer, but teachers who live very rich lives have so much to offer. So yeah, but no one person stands out that much to me. I think if I were to choose one person, it would actually be my Nani. So my Nani was a real character. She lived life completely by her own rules. She would tell us, take me or leave me. I am the way that I am. She started painting at the age of 75, and then she just didn't stop painting. She would take down curtains one day, and the next day we'd see a familiar shirt, and it would be the curtain that was there yesterday made into a shirt that she would wear. She would meet someone in the elevator and, say hi to them and bring them home to stay with her for a week. So she was one of the most courageous, spunky people I ever met. And I remember really being in awe of her. I still have books that she had a very interesting penmanship, and she would write books and say that, this is for after I die, so that you will remember us. And when we lived away from India for many years, she would record on cassettes scary stories, and they would start by go and grab a pillow and hold it very close. And then she would tell us the most incredible stories and sing us songs. And so she was a very, very big continued inspiration for me.
Tell me more about her. What was her life like? Because in those times, the lives that women could lead were relatively really constrained. So, what was her life like, both in terms of what she did in general in the world, but also her interior life through the years, whatever you know of it?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I actually don't know that much. I mean, career wise, she was just at home, but I think she was such a character in how she lived her life. So I remember her telling her story. Her husband was a doctor, a pretty well-known doctor for many years, and very strict and a little conservative. And she would, when her daughter wanted to go out at night, my mom, she would stuff the bed with pillows to pretend that they were there. She was just a real character. I think what I remember about her is just that the idea that like, why do we have to live in the way that everyone expects us to live? And what does it mean to really be free? Like I think I'm free. And then sometimes I wonder whether like I'm putting constraints on myself and whether I really am free. I think my Nani was really free. And I think that's what stood out more than sort of what she did. But yeah, I remember her as a great cook, of just so much fun. Again, her cooking also was so interesting because she would just put anything together and somehow it would work, and the next day it would become something else and it would still work. And so that boldness and that spunkiness was very special about her.
What did she think of all the stuff that you went on to do later?
She was very happy. In fact, it's my parents' 60th wedding anniversary next week. And so I've been looking through putting together something for them, looking through a lot of old things. And I found must be the first article that was ever written on Akanksha. And in her handwriting, she's written, "My dearest granddaughter, I am so proud of what you are doing." I think she was very proud. I think she understood in a way, early on, in a way that many other people in the beginning didn't quite understand.
Yeah, and there's such a sort of a lovely straight line from her through your mom to you. It almost, feels like the same spirit going through. Tell me about how the journey began. Like you were in Tufts and, you were going to have a conventional sort of education and so on and so forth. And then at the age of 18, you came here for a vacation. Tell me about that phase. What happened and what happened to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I actually was very happy in the US and I liked Tufts a lot. I liked what I was learning. I was dating someone. I had friends. There was no compulsion to leave. I was not looking for anything. At the same time, every summer we'd come back to India to visit grandparents. And every time I came back through these volunteering experiences, also just physically through flying back into the city and seeing the disparity. Like when you fly into Mumbai and you see high-rise buildings, you see the low-income communities that had always bothered me, summer after summer. And I think at 18, I was on one of those very similar trips. In fact, my trip was booked back a week later to go back to join my second year at Tufts. And I was stopped at a traffic light in a black and yellow taxi right outside the Air India building. And a few kids ran to the window. I don't know, Amit. I think in that moment, something just felt like, why not stay here? It was literally that interaction with those children. And it was a fleeting sort of thought. But somehow I went back, and I think I'd had that thought before and sort of done nothing about it. But I think what was different about that particular time was I went back without thinking too much, and I called my dad and I said, I don't want to come back to the US. And it really was just an instinct. I think now when I look back, there are many connections and dots that I connect back to volunteering, my mom's work, so many different things. But at that moment, it was just an instinct that said, look, I've never lived in India. I don't really have roots anywhere. So that was one sort of thing I think that was pulling me. And the second more important one was like, why not try to do something in India? It feels like I can be more useful here than anything I can do in the US at this point.
I often refer to this great book of science fiction by China Miéville called The City and the City. And the premise of the book is that there are two cities which are actually in exactly the same geographical place, but people from one city can't see people in the other city
Yeah.
broadly. And I often think of Indian cities a bit like that there are two cities overlapping, and there's a city you are in when you're driving inside your air conditioned car, and there's a city outside with what's happening in the pavement. And the easiest choice for everyone is to unsee what is there. Like if you're born here, that is kind of normalized. Like it's literally the seen and the unseen. It's kind of normalized, and you go in your little cocoon and you don't even think about it. And in your case, of course, firstly, you were from outside, so it wasn't so normalized for you, perhaps. But again, the easy choice for you is always to think that this is the way things are. I can't do anything about this. The world is too big and complex. Let me live my own life well. That's just a natural tendency. That's how everyone reacts. And there's nothing wrong also in reacting that way. What else can you do? But so what was it like for you to not unsee that and kind of take the easy way out? Like when you think of staying back, then the further questions that arose at that point, I suppose, would be stay back and do what specifically? Will it make a difference? Will I be able to do it? So take me a bit through your thought process at the time that, okay, I want to stay back, but why? Is it because you felt some kind of duty, or is it because you felt that empathy and said that, no, this is where I can make a difference? And if so, then what is that difference? Can I really do it? Take me through your thought process.
Yeah. I mean, so one, honestly, it didn't feel like a very difficult decision. And I think then for sure, but even today, like, I feel like I don't lead that much through my thoughts. And so I don't think I thought a lot actually about like what will happen. I was led more by my heart. Like, this feels like something I want to do. Let me do it. So that was one thing. I think the second is, I think I was comfortable being quite rebellious. And in general, I've been like quite rebellious and not that concerned about, winning or success. That's never been that important to me. So what's been more important to me is like, let me just try to do whatever I feel like I want to try to do, and we'll sort of see where we land. So I think that helped as well. I think the more people said like, this is a crazy idea, because at that time, very few people were coming back from the US to India. The more people said that, the more I was like, I want to do it, and I was more convinced about it. And I think maybe even some of the doubts I just quelled within myself, because I was hearing so many doubts around me, that I needed to at least be sure and have that conviction that this is something I wanted to do. So I think that was another point. In terms of what I wanted to do, well, my dad did put one condition on me, which I think was a reasonable condition. And he said, you need to get into college. So I knew that if I wanted to stay, I needed to get into a college. So I was clear that like that was one. I also had a safety net. I wrote to Tufts. I said, can you defer my admission for a year? So I also like wasn't completely like throwing everything away. So with all of that, and then of course the story of how I got into college is also a fun story. But I didn't know any universities in India. And so I just said, let me go where my parents went, because they'll be happy if I get into, that was Xavier's college. And I landed up at Xavier's. It was 3 months after admissions were over. And I said, I need to meet the principal about admissions. And they said, you can't meet the principal. I'd come back from the US. I said, what do you mean you can't meet the principal? And they said, no, admissions are over. He's not meeting students. And so I was standing outside the principal's office, and I was just in tears. And a sweet college student saw me crying and came up to me and said, what's wrong? And I said, I'm so angry because they're not letting me meet the principal. And she said, well, if you really want to meet the principal, there's a side door. And that's literally, I went through the side door, barged into Father Emil de Cruz's office, and basically just said, look, Father, my life is in your hands. I need to get admission to be able to stay in India. I want to work with my children. And he was I think a little taken aback and said, sit down, child, and made me promise. He said, Shaheen, are you sure you will do something good in India? And I said, Father, I promise you I will do something for children. So that's sort of how I got into Xavier. So I knew I was going to be in college, and I knew that would give me a base to then explore how I wanted to work with kids. And actually in the beginning, I didn't think about starting something on my own. There also wasn't a drive to do something that was my own. I just wanted to work with children. And so I started by like looking to see if I could volunteer with other places. But most places I went, like, they weren't willing to give me the kind of responsibility that I wanted. And that sort of led me into saying, let me explore, let me go into a community on my own and see what the needs are. And then, my work slowly grew out of there.
Do you think that, some element of the drive also comes from the fact that you courageously went all in? You just chose to stay. And of course, you truly went all in a year later when you told Tufts, okay, I'm not taking it. And you still had that option. But in a sense, you did go all in the sense you're foregoing even that year and you're making that promise to a principal that I will do something, etc., etc. It's almost as if you've staked so much on it that you don't have a choice. Is that a factor, or were you just so internally driven that you were just going to do it anyway, whatever the it was?
Yeah, no, I'm sure that was a factor. I also think my age was a factor. Like people say, oh, at 18 you started something, but I actually see it very differently. I feel like at 18, you're much less risk averse. In fact, today, if, I need to start something, I will think 10 times more than when I was 18. At 18, you can be a little bit crazy. You still really believe that you can change the world. And so at 18, I think it's actually less difficult to go all in than later when you have other considerations. And also, like, I think the privilege that I had, of course, really helped as well. And I never forget that. Like, I did have the safety net of family. I had the safety net of money if I needed it. I knew that in the back of my head. So all in is also sort of relative. I think I was lucky to be able to take the step that I took.
So tell me about that journey of exploring what to do, figuring out what to do. Now that you're here, you've decided you're going to do it, but what and how? Tell me about that journey.
Yeah. So I think a few memories that are very like vivid still to me. One was like the first time I actually went into this community near the World Trade Center in Cuff Parade. And I was 18 and, had never lived in India, so spoke no Indian language and had a very mixed up accent from living in all of these different countries at the time. And I met a girl who was also 18. Her name is Sandhya. And she, there's so much generosity in our community. She welcomed me into her home and sat down and gave me chai. And she had a very lovely mother who I grew very fond of, who would then, call me for every single festival to celebrate festivals with them. But that first day itself, a couple of kids sort of ran into her home, and I think they were struggling with their homework. And I sat and just started teaching them a little bit. And she called me back the next day and the next day. And so every day from college, I would go and I would just spend 3, 4, 5 hours in the community using her home as a base. And that became sort of like my first little classroom. And the home was 10 foot by 10 foot, tiny. But, every day, 6, 7, 8 kids would sort of squeeze in. And then one day, someone was sick and they needed help getting into hospital. So I did a lot of just one-on-one, just responding to what like people needed around me. And at the same time, with a friend of mine who spoke Hindi, we started going around the community asking people what they wanted. If we were to do anything and start anything, what would they want? And sanitation came up a lot. Water came up a lot. There was no running water in the community at that time. And school came up a lot. A lot of kids were not in school. A lot of kids in school were dropping out of school. And so I didn't know what to do about sanitation and water. But I felt very excited about the idea that education, in the beginning, it wasn't even so much about what education could do for livelihood or for someone's life. It was what like school could do to just give kids a space to be kids. I think one of the things that struck me in my early observations of the community were just how difficult the lives of little kids were. They were all helping out with families. They didn't have any privacy, any space to just be themselves, to have fun. And so the initial idea was really, can I find a space where we can take children for a few hours every day where they can be children? And so learning was a small component of that, but the bigger component was fun and safety and feeling like kids could come and just forget about everything else for a few hours every day. And so 6 months into like spending time in the community, I also felt that this space needed to be outside of the community, because I said if kids sort of see a school, they're going to aspire to go to a school and to change their lives. And it was interesting to me that despite living in a city like Bombay, our kids knew nothing about the city that they lived in. Like beyond their community, they didn't know where the nearest police station was, fire station was. And so another part of the intention of getting them out was to say, can they sort of explore and have exposure to different things? And so then I went looking for a school and went to 20 odd schools, just saying, can I have a classroom for a few hours each day? And the schools all said no. And I think that also fueled a lot of, I was a much angrier young person, and I got really angry. I said, all I want is an empty classroom. These are schools that have space. I'm just asking for one room. I'm telling them I will bring a broom and clean the classroom at the end, and they are not willing to give me a space. And some of the reasons they gave me also were, to me, they were really appalling, like eminent schools saying, this is a very revolutionary concept, whereas for me, this was basic education. Or, that your kids come from a fishing village and they will smell, and our classrooms will smell if you bring them into. So all of those things, I think, fueled a lot of like disbelief, anger, motivation to find a space. And finally, another father sort of came to my rescue, Holy Name School in Colaba, Father Ivo. And I walked in. I was genuinely about to give up the idea because I didn't think I would get a space. And I said, I've been to 20 schools and they've all said no. And he looked at me. I was very worked up, and he said, sit down. And he said, what do you want? And I said, I just want a classroom for 2 hours a day. And he said, when do you want to start? And I was so nervous that he would change his mind that I said, tomorrow. I said, and so he said, okay. And so that was really the first space. And so I brought kids from this community, 60 kids in the beginning, to this space. And the teachers were all volunteers from Xavier's. So I would go around, I don't even have a recollection of this, but I recently was talking to one of our early volunteers, and she said, literally, Shaheen, it was so funny because you would come with a cassette player and you would play We Are the World, and we would all be like very very shocked as to why this. And I wore cotton saris at Xavier's. I was the only kid. I had come back. I just wanted to be very Indian when I came back, and I had big bindis and cotton saris, and I would play We Are the World. And then I would tell people, surely you have 2 or 3 hours a week to make the country better. And everyone would be a little bit taken aback. And I would recruit volunteers, and those volunteers would actually teach kids. So the model was really simple. Let's get volunteers to give a part of their week. Let's bring in children who really want to learn, and let's find available spaces free of cost. So it was a low cost model, and set up these centers for children that became the Akanksha centers.
And I'm really struck by, again, here there's a massive all-in commitment where you say that we'll start tomorrow, because then you actually have to figure out the logistics of getting the kids all the way to Colaba where the school is, and and you actually then manage to hire a school bus in a day, which was your only expense for 4 years. Tell me a bit then about how you think about what you're going to teach the kids and what the volunteers are going to teach, and making all these pieces fit. Because at one level, like you've said, it's not even so much specifically about teaching, but just giving them the safe space where they can be kids and, be respected for that, and, be out of the environment of where they are staying, where there's so much else going on and there are so many demands on them. So that's great. But once they're actually in that shared space, how do you figure out that, and I'm sure they weren't all the same age or whatever, so how do you figure out that what do we teach them? Do we have the skills? Who teaches what? How do we deal with unruly kids? What language do we speak to them? And not just in terms of literally language, but just the approach that you take, because all your volunteers would have been from a completely different kind of social class. So tell me about those early days and making all of those pieces kind of fit and understanding what you're really doing.
Yeah. So I think one big part, because the initial class had kids from the age of 3 to the age of 15. So these were all kids who had not been in school before. So it was a very big question of what to do. And before even learning, just getting them to sit down was a massive effort. Like, they were unruly. They came to class basically to run to the bathroom, and Holy Name School had these huge sinks, and they would jump into the basins and literally have a bath and come sopping wet back to class. So one part was like, how do we just settle them down? And the way we responded to that, and a lot of this was instinct, a lot of it was asking people, because as volunteers, we had so little experience. And a lot of it was going back to our own school days to say, like, what worked for us and how do we bring that to these children? So relationships was a very big part from the beginning, that like, we have to love our kids and really like show them that we care about them. That was a big one. And the second was fun. We instinctively felt that like, if kids have fun, they're going to get more engaged. So those were our two like chief behavior management strategies in the early days. And it worked mostly. And we had many bad days still, where volunteers would cry at the end of the day and quit, etc. In terms of learning, so one was talking a lot to the kids and families, and realizing that like, kids were not able to read. So that seemed like a huge priority, just literacy. And they were really bad at math if they had any basic skills. So language and math sort of seemed like the obvious first places to start. And right at the beginning, actually, somehow, and I don't know how we decided this, but this idea of like building values was also there right from the beginning. Like, we wanted our kids to be confident. We wanted them to be caring. And so that became a big part of the culture. Also, interestingly, actually, like now, with everything I've learned about education in the last 35 years, a lot of what we do today actually isn't that different from what we did in the early days. So one of the things we did was we believed a lot that kids learn better when like learning is relevant and meaningful. So we would choose themes. We would weave everything through the theme. I remember very early on, one of my favorite themes was actually the theme of faith with kids. And what we did was every week we examined a different religion. And we did it in a really fun way. We'd go and visit the place of worship together. We'd bring in a prayer from the religion. We'd bring in food. We'd have someone from the religion come and talk. And then each week, we'd sort of compare what are the similarities and differences across different religions. So I think that idea that respect for all people matters was a very early thought. The idea that fun in learning, like kids have to love learning, that was a very early thought. But really planning was very informal. Sundays we would sit, volunteers together at someone's home, and we just brainstorm together, and we'd put down those plans, and then we'd learn very quickly, like this worked, this didn't work. I think reflection was also a very early thought, even though I wouldn't have called it reflection at the time, but just pausing at the end of every day to say what worked, what didn't work, and being very, very open and hungry to learn from others.
You were hungry to learn. Tell me also about their hunger to learn and how how they deal with their circumstances. Because in your book, for example, there are many, heartbreaking descriptions of the stuff that happened to them. The girl who got gang raped, she was 6 months pregnant when she was in Akanksha. You see her through that, you get her back to school. All kinds of terrible things are happening to the kids. And how much did you learn about that and learning to deal with that? Because sometimes you have an unruly kid in class, there might be a tendency to lose your temper, but I guess over time you kind of realize that everyone has some kind of deep backstory, and you just have to sit back and understand each individual and what they're going through. And what does it tell you then about, what did you learn about them? That were they able to normalize the shit that was happening to them and just focus on what they wanted to do? Is it the case that some of the ways in which the outcomes you got were so much better than other schools might even have been because you got kids who were more driven because of a selection effect, that if they were leaving their circumstance and they're coming all the way to you and fighting to get on that bus, then they are that much hungrier than other kids anywhere else, so they will work that much harder. What did you learn about those kids, and what did they teach you, as you sort of went through that process?
I mean, this is such a big question, because I think that, I pretty much owe everything that I am, and the way I see the world, the way I see myself, what has become important to me, to lessons that I've learned from my children over the years and continue to learn. I think one is I went in very naively, thinking that I had a lot to give, and that I would just be very disturbed again by everything that they were going through. And that is a part of it. And that has been true. And it continues to feel very unfair that children go through a lot of what they go through. I think what I wasn't prepared for, but I was very overwhelmed by, is just all the positive things that exist in low-income communities. The kind of courage they have, the kind of ability to be light in difficult times. And so to your point, kids would bring these really big problems and still be able to really laugh in class and be able to really ask how we were and mean it, even though probably what they were struggling with was infinitely bigger than what we were. They were so hungry to learn. I think one of the things that has kept me in the work over time has been just the gratitude that children have for opportunity when they come from lower income backgrounds is just humbling. One of my favorite memories was we had a session with our teachers at Akanksha, and I would very often suddenly get a last minute idea. And so I'd planned a very different session, but I just decided that day to tell our teachers, just spend 3 hours and just go walk on the streets and just go meet a child who lives and works on the street and just talk to them and come back and we'll sort of debrief. And I remember 3 hours later, one of our teachers, Caroline, she came back, and she's usually a little bit quiet, but she came back full of she just wanted to share. She's, can I share? Can I share? She had met this child, Salman, at the Haji Ali traffic light, who lived on the street. He used to, in fact, put all of his few clothes and possessions, he would climb up and hide them behind the back of a hoarding so that they would stay safe. The police would come regularly and take his books. He was selling books at the traffic light, throw the books into the sea. And she said, I kept talking to him, asking him, Salman, what are your problems? What are your problems? And he kept saying, nothing, Didi, nothing, Didi. And I couldn't understand. He was 12 years old. And I kept asking him, no, but Salman, how can you not have challenges in your life? And she said, finally, after an hour and a half of talking to him, he looked at me and he said, Didi, of course I have challenges. Don't you have challenges? But I don't choose to focus on them. And she was so blown away by that child. He'd never been to school before. She said, I want to put him in my classroom. And I said, Caroline, are you sure? He's at a completely different level than your other kids. She said, yes, I want to do that. That child ended up in her classroom, graduating from school, ended up getting a scholarship, going to the US. I mean, it's just an incredible story, but that hunger to, one of the things she used to tell me is I would give kids homework and he would call me saying, I finished. Can you give me more homework? That drive to make good with the opportunities we have. And on the other hand, I was privy to this life where kids had so much and yet just weren't doing much with what they had. And so that contrast was always really interesting to me. I think also I learned the courage to be vulnerable from my kids. The fact that they could in front of the whole class share these really difficult things about their life and their families and their feelings. And I really began to learn that it's fine, there's nothing that's so special and unique about me and my life that I can't really share it in a way that perhaps can help others around me. So just countless lessons, also just how to laugh at yourself. Kids have this incredible ability to just be in the moment and be present. I would notice that too, still today, every time my mind wanders forward and I just see a child in the moment. I have a new friend who has a 5-year-old daughter, and we were having dinner with her a couple of weeks ago. And as we walked back to her house, this little girl looked up and she was just in her own world saying, "Good night, moon. Good night, pavement. Good night, dog. Good night, cat." And really authentically and seriously that. And I looked at her and I thought her connection to the universe, to the world around her, there's so much to learn from that. So one of my big things over time has been there's so much wisdom in children if we stop to listen and learn.
Yeah, I mean, Salman's story was actually one of the things that even struck out from the book. He got 81% in his 12th standard exams, went to KC College.
Yeah.
And I think somewhere it's mentioned that he would call up Caroline later and be a support to her. Couple of questions. One is completely orthogonal and different from, the subject of what we're talking about today. But since you mentioned it, that connection that kids often have, goodbye moon, good night moon, good night pavement, etc., etc., that genuine connection that they have, which is accompanied by a genuine curiosity about the world and engagement. They're putting themselves out there. They want to know, they care, they're this thing. And I've noticed that is almost universal in kids at a certain point in time, and it almost universally vanishes as we become adults. So much so that when you recognize that it was there, or if you crave that quality within yourself, if you feel too jaded sometimes, as I do, then you have to make it an act of intentionality to try and engage like that. And even then it's bloody hard because you're just not used to it. What happens there? Why do we lose it? Do you sort of have any observations about it? And are you more likely to lose it if you're a rich kid from a good background than if you are an underprivileged child growing up in a slum where you have no escape from those engagements, as it were? You could literally be sleeping on the pavement for that matter. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, it's such a good question. I mean, I think most people lose it irrespective of background. My guess is for very different reasons, though. I think some of my observations are, with our students from lower income backgrounds, life is just very, very hard and it doesn't let up. And so keeping your optimism, your ability to navigate it through those different milestones of your own life feels very difficult. I think where I've seen people able to navigate it, this idea of interconnectedness and community has been a huge one. Like if they have a community around them that can support them in difficult times, that can challenge them when they're not, that I found has made a very big difference with our students. With higher income kids, and I think like I would include myself in that category as well. I think a lot of it is just like conditioning. There's so much social conditioning on what is the right way to think, what is the right way to dress, what is the right way to be. And I think somewhere like the curiosity to tap into like who you really are, how you really want to see life, what questions you really want to ask, what answers you really want to find. They sort of like get lost in the how I should lead my life. And so I've been thinking a lot more about that idea more recently, that what does it take to become more and more aware that so many of my actions, my thoughts are actually like just conditioning, and how can I at least be aware of that and then choose whether I want to continue down that path. I think the education system is a huge culprit for killing curiosity too. I mean, I just think we put kids into a system where we systematically take away their innovation, their ability to be creative, their ability to be curious. We tell them they ask too many questions. We don't like most of the questions they ask. And I think education can play a massive role in either building or sort of killing curiosity for kids.
Another digressive question. Do you think it helped for you to have been an outsider? Like, because you were an outsider in a sense, you could see the things that other people would not see or normalize or take for granted, like what is outside your car at a traffic signal. And you could you could see the world in a different way and even show that to your fellow students at Xavier's, playing We Are the World from a tape recorder in a cotton sari is such an awesome, charming story. But, being an outsider would really help you do that. And would really help them then take that seriously when it comes from you. So, you feel that it always helped in every environment? Like you're an outsider when you come to India, but within India, you are also an outsider when you go to an underprivileged community in a slum or wherever. Being a perennial outsider, and there's a phrase I read in a recent FT essay, I think by Janan Ganesh, called partial outsider, in the sense that you are an outsider in terms of the way that you see what's happening, but you're not a complete outsider. You still have enough influence within the system to be able to do things. You can get volunteers, you can tell those guys, and you can gather up the volunteers, and at the same time you're going to the schools and you manage to get that classroom. So you can make a difference. You're not so much on the outside that you can't do anything. You can make a difference, but because you can see differently, all the stuff that people just take for granted and that they've normalized, you can actually see all of that. And that is such a huge part of the puzzle, because I don't think, for example, that without that, someone is going to start Akanksha. Without that, any 18-year-old who's just grown up here and is going to Xavier's as a matter of course is going to even think of doing something like this. Do you think that's part of...
I mean, it's such an interesting question. I mean, I think I've both been very grateful for and also struggled a lot with being an outsider. I think, to your point, I think 100% the ability to see, I think, was greatly aided by being an outsider, because literally I was traveling from Greenwich, Connecticut, where there were 60 girls in my class who on their 16th birthday got a BMW, right? And I would be transported here, and I would see children who were, struggling to make ends meet. And so the contrast that came from being an outsider, parachuting in, going back, I think was very striking and a very, very big reason why I was able to see. In fact, I was very aware very early on of that, because I was very puzzled by how my cousins who lived here were not able to see in ways that I was able to see. And so I think definitely being an outsider helped in that way. I do think, though, that like this need to belong that I think most of us crave in some way. Like, this idea of like being sort of a global citizen is an identity that's hard to connect in your heart with, And so sometimes I also still feel like a very confused person. Like I don't fully fit in here. I also don't fully fit in anywhere else. I'm likely more comfortable, interestingly, celebrating Christmas than I am, but I'm not Christian. And it's a little bit of a medley, and I feel grateful in many ways for that. I think my ability to see things, my ability to adapt to things, my willingness to like act, I think comes from that space. And yet sometimes I feel like a little bit envious of people who just are more comfortable with like one cuisine and one way of living. And I feel a little bit on the outside there.
There's a lovely phrase I learned from an earlier guest on the show, Sugata Srinivasa Raju, which is rooted cosmopolitanism.
Nice.
And he was one, and he was speaking about others who were, and I reflected on that, and my lament is that I am not one. I am cosmopolitan, but I am not rooted enough, and part of my not being rooted enough really comes from, a similar reason to yours, that you grow up in an elite household, and everything I would consume when I was young was Western culture. So I would listen to rock, and I would read Russian novelists before I read Indian ones, and so on and so forth. I mean, a complete deracinated elite, as it were. And I've always lamented that, because as time goes by, you realize that firstly the snobbery was wrong. I mean, you described how you were also, putting Western culture on a pedestal, and learning the piano, and etc., learning ballet, and exactly the same happened to me. But then you come here, and you're working here, and you're living here, and you're among all of these people who have none of the shared cultural references that you do.
Yeah.
Not only the students you're teaching, but to a certain extent, even the other volunteers that you're working with. And what was that kind of process like? Because in one sense, you might feel that you can never truly belong, but this is what you've chosen to do, and you make the best of it. And at the other side, you do want to belong, and not for shallow reasons of wanting to fit in or wanting validation, but because you really want to belong. You also you value what they have. You value the culture, though you can't really immerse in it. So what was that process like for you, and just relating to them? Because one easy way of relating to someone from a different social background is just through a shared cultural thing, that hey, we like the same Govinda film, but you can't even do that. But then what happens? Do you make an effort to do that? After a while, do you give up on the effort and just go with the flow? How have you changed in that sense over the years?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I've discovered over time is that not at all to undermine difference, but I think what I started to see a lot through my journey here was that there is something bigger than our differences and our common humanity. When we're willing to sit in front of each other and actually look into each other's eyes and connect and listen to each other, there's something bigger than our differences. And I began to realize that that's actually what I want to belong to. That shared value system that says that like my story matters and your story matters, and my perspective matters and your perspective matters, and you can learn from me and I can learn from you. And so that's been what has kept me here. And I think that has grown. I think over time, what I feel most like heartened, proud of in the work is actually this interwoven community that has been built on values of humanity, I would say, just basic core values that like, I matter and my life matters, and it really doesn't matter that much as well. Like, how can you hold that and when you hold that and you start understanding that like your life matters as much as my life matters. And I think that for me has been a very, very interesting journey. I think it's also been like, interestingly, a journey from like big to small. I think, when we were talking about when I was 18, I genuinely thought I was going to find like the solution that was going to change the world. And today I've like come so far from that idea to say like, no, like, I mean, I can't even change my two daughters at home. Forget, it's really about like small actions that I take every single day myself. And then just letting go beyond that. Like there may or may not be a ripple based on that, but that's really all that I'm in control of. So like just deep relationships have helped me feel a sense of belonging, connection, and understanding of values and what they mean to me has led me to feel a sense of belonging. And I think just purpose, and I think my purpose it's been consistent and it's evolved over time. But I think just asking like, why do I do what I do? I think that has also given me a deep sense of purpose.
Would it be fair to say that the purpose would have consistently been a sense of wanting to do good, but evolved from a notion of achieving this grand aim to just doing the right thing every day?
Yeah. I think that's accurate. I mean, if I were to say the sort of arc of purpose, I think it actually started with like what I said, like kids need a break. Like I had a great childhood. Why can't these kids have a safe, fun childhood? So it was just its intention to create a safe space for kids, to a real belief in education as being a platform that not only can shift your life, but can make things better. To a place where I started to see like the power of education much, much more vividly, that education is not just about me, the job I get, the life I lead. It actually is shaping our nation and our world, and what we do in our classrooms is doing that. To this idea that like, while all of that matters, like ultimately all I can do is focus on how did I live this day? And, did I take the steps that I felt were most appropriate towards like the human being that I most want to be? Yeah.
Tell me also about the connections that one makes while one is teaching. Like typically in a school, you will see your teacher in a fixed role. They are a teacher and it is a stereotype and it is a role, it is a job description. And they might also look at students as, just creatures to be handled in the course of a day, and there's no human connection. In your case, one, there is already a pre-existing human connection because they have shown much greater hunger to be there, and you have shown much greater commitment to do this because it's not your career or your profession or whatever. But beyond that, there is also that moment where you break through and you make the connection. Like at one point you said teachers would come to the class and they would genuinely ask you how you are, and mean it. So tell me about those connections, because those connections seem central to making the whole exercise work. But how does one foster that connection? How does one break through that wall in the first place, where you are not just, a kind auntie who is teaching us something, but you're a human being, and equally for you to look at each person like that. For someone like you, I imagine it would have come more naturally than, maybe for one of your Xavier's friends who's just come over and said, let me help out. But they may not have that natural and immediate sense of empathy or connection. So how does one foster that connection? Like, are there tactics, are there ways to get past whatever wall there is to begin with?
Yeah. I mean, so two ideas when I'm also thinking about like what are my biggest sort of bets, right, for this idea and for education. And the first is related exactly to what you said, and it's just the idea of love. Like, I feel like when I look at the education system, the value that I see the most is fear. Everybody's scared. Kids are scared of their teacher is scared of their HM is scared of the block level officer, and it just goes all the way up the system. And I think unless we make the shift from fear to love, there is no space for genuine connection, for listening, for bringing your whole self to your learning. And when I say love, I don't say love in a fluffy way, and I use the word love intentionally. I feel like helping ourselves. I mean, starting with like, do I love and accept who I am today in this moment? Do I love and accept my children and who they are in class or at home? Do I love the content I'm teaching? Do I love, like, the power of what education can be? There's so many different manifestations of love, but my feeling is where you see people who love, they are willing to do whatever it takes. And I think we need to do whatever it takes to unleash our kids' potential. So the idea of love and understanding that and breaking that into small actions feels like a very big starting point. And I think linked to that, specifically with connection, I found that when people talk to each other genuinely, like not like surface level talk, but actually talk and share their stories, connection just grows very, very naturally. I don't have to have lived your life to develop empathy, but I do have to be open to listening to your story and who you are. And we've seen beautiful manifestations of this in classrooms where literally you just hold space in a circle and you don't have to respond and you don't have to defend. You just have to listen when someone shares their story. And so I think building that practice into classrooms is a great way to build connection. I think the other thing is, do we see our kids as students in a classroom, or do we see them as children beyond the classroom as well? And so one of the things that I've done consistently, and I think we encourage others to do, is like get to know your kids outside of class, right? They're not students. They're much broader human beings. And so going to their homes, getting to know their families, like finding out about their interests, their favorite songs, the things that, getting to know people. And I feel like this even at work, that there's so many dimensions to the people that we work with, and yet we tend to see them through such a narrow lens. I was with one of my board members 3 days ago, and I had no idea that his father was a very eminent painter and that he paints himself. And, I don't know, it's just so beautiful to tap into this idea that there are multiple aspects to a human being. So that's one thought. I think my second thought, like my most radical hope for the education system, is that we actually change the role of the child in the system itself. I think, again, we've always thought of kids as the recipients of the actions that we take as adults. And so we've never really stopped to ask our children, why do you want to learn? How do you want to learn? What do you want to learn? We think we know best. And yet over years and years, we've really made a mess of the education system. And so what does that look like? That idea of partnership with kids, I think that also builds real connection, because when I think of you as an equal, whether you're like 5 years old or 15, everything changes. The whole construct of a classroom changes, right? It goes from one expert at the front of the room to like 30 kids listening to no, we're 31 learners, and I'm leading in some ways and you're following in some ways, and you're leading in some ways and I'm following in some ways. And if you think of classrooms as sort of an interconnected web, that is really beautiful, because the child who may not be as good at math may be the most compassionate child in class, and there's something to learn about compassion from that child. And so everyone has something to learn, everyone has something to teach in a classroom. But then if you take that concept of partnership with kids up across the system, it gets even more exciting, because at the level of a school, it means that a school leader doesn't have to solve all the problems on their own, but they form committees in school around big problems, and kids are able to contribute. One of the things I've found the most heartwarming is that children love to do good. Like when you give them opportunities to do good, they get so excited. They bring so much like joy to that process. And you can see that right up to the level of system, like partnership with kids. The next time the new education policy is written, why are there not equal numbers of children, not symbolic representation, equal numbers of children at the table drafting that policy document? Because ultimately they are our number one stakeholder in education. So yeah, so the idea of love and the idea of partnership have felt like two very big unlocks.
You spoke about how our education system just kills curiosity out of the child and just deadens him completely. And a couple of things happen. One is that our education system is really built not for educating, but for sorting. So that constant fear that you spoke about is always there because the kids always have a competitive exam somewhere on the horizon. And it's not so much about learning anything. You're just trying to game whichever competitive exam is ahead of you. And it's terribly competitive. So that just leads to stress and toxic emotions and all of that, and it's really hard. And the approach that parents have to their kids schooling also typically is that schools are a convenient daycare center. They're out of the hair for a whole day, and that's how they think about it, and they don't involve themselves any more than that in education. Now, everything that you're saying seems an awesome model for a small group of committed people to be able to do in one school or two schools, and gradually build it up to more schools than that. But how does it look at a systemic level? Like, how do you change it at a systemic level just in terms of incentives? Because an ideal system of education where you don't have 30 students and one teacher, but instead 31 co-learners, and it's a partnership and you're helping each other. It sounds amazing, but it demands, a certain amount of commitment from teachers in school, and it demands that the incentives be in place for all of this to happen, and within our current system they simply are not. So any school that functions like that is an outlier, a push towards that by motivated people like yourselves, but the system continues to be moribund and completely dysfunctional. So what is your sort of alternative vision for what can work? And you have done it at some kind of scale, in the sense both for what Akanksha started doing in the late 2000s by the public private partnerships, and moving from running centers which would teach you outside of school to actually running entire schools. So you've gone from theory to practice and kind of applied all of that. And equally for Teach for India, you've over the years developed your own teaching philosophies. So take me through some of these learnings, and what I'm specifically interested in is that how can we make systemic changes which allow this to scale?
Yeah. So, I think about systemic change a lot, and I think about it a little bit differently than I usually hear it referred to. So what I don't believe will work in education is silver bullet solutions. I don't think there's any small incremental thing which is really low cost that we can get to hundreds of thousands of children. And I worry a lot that a lot of resources in the country back programs like that. What I do believe will change the system is people and an investment in people. And so I think the Teach for India idea to me is where I still stay, because the multiplier impact of investing deeply in people, not just in their skills, but in their mindsets, in their values, in the way they see education. I think that has a very powerful multiplier. And I think that if we invest more deeply in leadership in particular, I don't think there's been ever a time in my own life where this has felt as real as when we look at world events today and we see just the dramatic impact that a leader has, both ways, positive and destructive. And yet I think this idea of investing in leadership doesn't feel like a priority or something that people are talking about, right? Like even when we go out and we talk to potential partners, people are very clear about whether they want to invest in gender or inclusive education, but no one is saying actually what we want to back are the leaders that are going to be multipliers and shift the needle. And yet nothing in the world and in the history of the world has ever really shifted without leadership. And so I think if we want to change the system, we need enough people at all levels of the education system who think differently, who believe that we need to elevate the role of children, who believe that learning has to be holistic, who believe that, like, we need to change the way we think about assessments. And it's highly complex, right? To solve educational inequity today it cannot be solved by the teacher in the classroom alone. And as you said, where do you start? Because the system is so huge and so complex and so commercialized. I mean, I go into education conferences sometimes and I don't feel I'm in the world of education. Like, nobody's talking about kids. Nobody's talking about teachers. It's all about products and commoditizing. And so, like, we have a long way to go. I think because of the complexity and scale, our best bet is to say, how do we put 100,000 people into the system who think differently and want something differently, and make sure they get into positions of influence where they're actually able to shift things. So that's one idea with systemic change. My other idea is, like, is there a way we can get straight to kids? Because, kids get it. Like, the reason I think so many things fail in the education system is they have to go through so many layers to reach the child that they get stopped at some level or the other, right? You may have a very driven school principal, but then if the teacher isn't driven, it won't get to the child. Or you may have a driven teacher, but if, like, the principal's putting pressure, I think if we can think more and more, and this is where I feel very, like, bullish about tech as well, that how do we get some of these programs and ideas directly to children and focus on making them self-learners today so that they can access what they need in a very, like, non-traditional way. So I think there's hope. I think we have a lot of, like, pieces there and a lot of starting momentum in the country too, and a lot of bright spots. I mean, I don't know how many people see the range of bright spots, but there's a lot of really good things happening in the country in education to build upon.
So, before we go back to your journey with Akanksha, one more sort of general question. And this must be something that, for you must be utterly obvious and internalized, and you even take for granted for you and, all the people who work with you. But nevertheless, assuming that one knows nothing about the subject, I'd like you to lay out the difference between two visions of the classroom. One vision of the classroom is what exists right now. And one vision of the classroom is what, you discovered through your journey and what you have evolved to. Because I would imagine that one thing that is happening in the early days of Akanksha, which might have seemed sometimes to be a bug but appears more of a feature to me, is that because you have no conventional notions of what education should be like, you don't actually have that much to unlearn. Instead, you are learning organically from the kids themselves how things should be taught and what that process is like. And from that, in a beautiful bottom-up way, you can evolve what is the best approach that actually works on the ground. So spell out the differences between these two visions to me, the way things are in a conventional classroom in an average Indian school today, and what you have arrived at through Akanksha and Teach for India and your personal experience as, something that works, something that should be the way forward.
Yeah. So, I mean, a disclaimer that it's hard to describe an average Indian classroom because, classrooms are so different across the country. And I do think there are many very beautiful classrooms in the country as well. But if I were to describe, like, a classroom that I think needs to change and like what that changed classroom were like, the classrooms that need to change, and I've seen many of these classrooms. Broadly speaking, you'll walk into the classroom, you'll see benches organized, like, almost sort of factory mode. The classroom will not be very, like, attractive to look at, not a lot of, like, visual stimulation, often not adequate ventilation, may not be safe infrastructure as well. You'll see one teacher, blackboard. You will usually see a quote of the day, which is not referred to on the board. You'll see kids open their textbooks. You'll see the teacher teach. and you'll see kids sort of like respond to what's in the textbook. So there's a lot of learning by rote. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of signaling that an exam is coming up. Learning is very academic. It's very knowledge based, and kids don't move a lot in school. Time is usually very, very chaotic. You will often see bullying during break time. In general, in this school, you will see lots of child safety violations. You may see teachers with canes. You will very often see teachers yelling, humiliating kids. You'll also see a lot of competition and comparison. So you'll see kids getting different opportunities. In the annual day, you'll have like your top performing 10 kids performing. So that's what you will see with children. You'll also see teachers with very little autonomy to be creative and teach themselves. Often teachers coming with, juggling very significant home responsibilities with school responsibilities, long days, given a lot of administrative work in schools as well. So it's difficult for teachers. And you'll see a lot of compliance in most levels of the classroom and schools. So kids will feel they have to listen to the teacher. Teacher will feel that they have to listen to the principal. So I think this is a school where kids will emerge with a lot of like dates in their head, a lot of content knowledge, some basic level skills. In reality, a lot of kids will not even learn basic skills. By grade 3, you'll have 70% of your kids falling behind, even in basics like reading. I think the classrooms that we believe can actually shape nations and change the world are classrooms where, firstly, we define the purpose of education more broadly. So education in our world is about 3 things. Self is the first. So an education that helps you discover your fullest potential, your purpose in life, and develop the skills to be able to get to that place. So that's one really important part of education. The second is an education that helps you thrive in the world with others. So where others are as important as you, where you're creating opportunities for them, you're learning how to listen, you're learning how to share, you're learning how to collaborate and work together in a world where like you're not going to get very far if you only know how to be by yourself. And in other also classrooms that are building communities that will hopefully sustain for life, where relationships are so strong that these will be your people who will be with you for life. And then the third dimension is India/world. So these are classrooms where you're learning about social issues around you. You're discovering what you would like to change or what you would like to create in the world. And you are practicing that repeatedly over the course of your education. So that may be something as beautiful as in one of our classrooms in Chennai, there was a hearing impaired child, grade 3. Kids decided they were unhappy that child didn't feel like he belonged in the classroom. So they chose to create a whole sign language for the child. It could be something like that. It could be something like, there's a big pile of garbage outside the school and kids decide they want to, figure out how to get it cleared up. So I think the purpose of education expanding is a huge part of changing the system, because then everything changes, right? If you're going to school thinking I'm going there just to graduate from grade 10, it's a very different thing that is happening in school. If you're going to school believing I'm here to learn the values, the skills, the knowledge to change the world, that's a very different form of learning. So purpose of education looks different. The relationship between the teacher and the student and students look different. These are relationships that are caring and kind, where everybody is listened to, where, not just the first 3 kids that put their hands up are called upon, but every child is asked to share, where every child expresses themselves. So the relationships are fundamentally different. The methodology is fundamentally different. So in these classrooms, we're looking at what is age appropriate for children developmentally. We're catering to a wide range of learners. We understand that all kids don't learn from textbooks. Some kids will learn better visually. Some kids will learn through movement. So we'll build a lot of that methodology into class. These are classrooms where we actually move beyond content, especially in today's world where content is available at the click of a button, to say, are we building the skills that kids will need for the marathon of life, right? So skills of creativity, skills of collaboration, skills of critical thinking. These are classrooms where kids are asking lots of questions to each other, where they are able to challenge each other and the teacher. Classrooms that feel like safe for dialogue and debate. And these are classrooms, finally, where we look at success very differently. Like, success is not just a pen and paper exam where some kids will succeed and many will not, but success is defined differently for different children. It's like, have I gone further than I was last week in the areas that I care about and want to move forward in?
How much of a struggle is it to build a classroom like this within the educational system that we have? Because it is one thing to say that, hey, the kid should not be stressed out about the 10th grade exams or the 12th grade exam, but instead think of personal growth and etc., etc. But the point is that the 10th grade exam is there, the 12th grade exam is there. That's just they can't ignore that, especially if they are from underprivileged backgrounds. It is in fact their ticket to to a better life. So how difficult is it? How hard is it? Then does it become that, look, those are the non-negotiables, we have to do that, but within that somehow we find the time, we build the spirit, we build the purpose.
Correct. It's that. So I mean, Teach for India also, we take grade 10 exams very seriously. We understand that is a key milestone for our children. 95% of our kids actually clear grade 10 in their first attempt as well. So it's a very important piece. My sense, though, is there's so many years in school, there is a lot of flexibility. I think it's really about holding the question within these constraints. How do we make learning really matter? And like one of the things, I mean, I call them the 5 magic questions that I think can really shift how classrooms happen. But question number 1 is like, why are we learning what we are learning? And 90% of times when I walk into a classroom, I'm not able to answer that question. It's meaningless. Like, they may be learning, there may be activities even happening, but it doesn't matter. They don't need to learn that. And so really thinking, like, even if you're constrained by, I'm teaching grade 9, I have to do this particular text chapter, make it meaningful. When you ask yourself how you can make it meaningful, you can add additional text. You can give kids some stuff to do for homework that is faster. You can use time in classroom for discussion. I think we just need to hold the question, and for teachers to have the agency and feel empowered to make it meaningful. So I think that is very, very doable and important. And I think there's enough flexibility. I think the other thing that we realized during COVID was, I mean, it's just sort of insane that learning stopped because schools shut. If you think about it, right? Like, the fact that learning, which is so much bigger than schools, just stopped. And so I think a lot about, like, why do we think that learning time is only instructional classroom time? If we were to design kids' experience as all of their waking hours, what might that unlock as well? So I think there's flexibility of time. With technology today, there's also flexibility of who teaches. Because the other thing that is a sort of paradigm of the past is, if you happen to get a good teacher, you were lucky. And if you didn't, you were not lucky. But today, anyone can be your teacher, right? And a teacher can actually bring and access so many resources into the classroom. So I think we can reinvent, like, where we teach, when we teach, how we teach. But I think a lot of it is possible within the existing system. In fact, TFI is often thought about, like, would it be easier if we just went more alternative, worked outside the system? But we're very committed to working in the system because ultimately it needs to change for all children.
Can you give me a concrete sense of what it would look like if you design a child's learning to be something continuous and not just, an instructional hour in a classroom? Like, what would it look like? What do you do?
We experimented with it a lot during the pandemic. So imagine all of your students are on a WhatsApp group, for example. And so there's a prompt first thing in the morning that you get at home with 3 forms of different ways that you can exercise, right? So you're getting physical education there. Then you're given independent reading time. So you have an independent reading hour. So all of this happens before you even come into school. Then when you come into school, you have centers in your classroom, which are differentiated. So kids are actually not all learning the same thing at the same time, but say it's reading hour, they're learning books according to their own interests or their own reading levels. So you can differentiate during the school day as well. Then there's choice block in the day where kids can actually choose anything that they want to work on. There's independent reflection time where they're reflecting on their own individual journey over the last hour. Then they go home. And again, maybe there's a project that they're working on in their community. So they're given a prompt and they go out and they're surveying people in their community. Then they're actually given 3 questions that they can answer with any TV show that they choose to watch, right? So you can actually tie like learning back to life in really interesting ways when you just, again, hold the question that like my kids are learning all the time anyway. Right? Like on average, a high income kid today is spending like 5 to 7 hours on social media, right? So they're learning through all of that. How are you sort of directing their learning differently beyond their formal like classroom instruction time?
And speaking of spending, another digression, speaking of spending 5 to 7 hours on social media every day, how does that impact the learning process? Because you would literally have seen the whole cycle from the late 80s and early 90s to where there is no internet, there are no phones, there is no social media, to today where a person's attention can often be, very choppy, where you're in this choppy rhythm of scroll, swipe, that affects attention spans. I don't entirely by the notion that attention spans have shortened entirely, because people do listen to my 8-hour episodes and people do binge watch TV series, 10 episodes one after the other. I do it myself. But, in general, that sort of slow immersion that was possible back in the day where you discover a nice book and you just sit with it is much harder, even for us, forget the kids. How do you think that impacts learning, and does that change classrooms? And is that something that you've had to account for and perhaps use as a feature and not a bug in interesting?
Yeah. So with our children, the time that they're on social media is much less, also because they, in general, are using like a parent's phone and don't have access to their own phone. So in that way, I think it's not impacted us in the same way that it impacts higher income children. And I think I'm still really trying to learn and understand this better, Amit. But I think the thing that feels most striking to me is the socio-emotional impact. And that has to impact learning in the long term. And so the fact that like kids are constantly looking at the best versions of what someone chooses to show them, and are feeling, especially adolescent girls, more and more inadequate looking at that. Like that sense of self, the idea that I need to project someone who, again, society wants me to project versus who I authentically am. That idea that, I can have 500 friends, but they're not really friends, but I don't know the difference between a real friend and a friend online. The dangers that we expose our children to, and they're sort of living in this alternate world that we actually don't know because we're not even aware of what they're doing on social media. I think those pieces, like educating, I'm not at all of the belief that the answer is like to take away all of this from kids, because I think they're going to find really smart ways to access it. But how do we educate kids about, like, again, how all of this can be used for positive ways and what the risks are to them with all of this is something that I think is very, very nascent in the country. I don't think a lot of people are doing it. We're certainly not doing it yet, and we need to be thinking a lot more about it.
You mentioned a few moments ago that there were 5 magic questions that you ask in a classroom. You shared the first of them. Why are we learning what we are learning? What are the other 4 questions?
Yeah. So the first one is around purpose. Why are we learning what we're learning? The second one is around integration. So does the content integrate values that you want to teach? And I think this has been a huge one, right? If you're choosing a reading comprehension, are you choosing some irrelevant reading comprehension, or are you perhaps doing a reading comprehension based on like the events that are happening in the US right now, for
But
example?
how would learning geography integrate, for example?
So with geography, you find values that are inherent in the content. And so if I'm learning about geography, I may integrate the idea of travel or exposure, but you really think about like purpose and integration. Those 2 questions sort of go together. And they're in my planning phase, I'm thinking about, does it matter? And am I teaching something that goes beyond just knowledge in the class? So those are the first 2 questions. The third question is mastery. So have kids learned what I'm teaching? I think a new teacher mistake often is, if I teach, kids learn. This is not true. Most of the times when we teach, kids don't learn. So what does it mean to have regular checks for understanding through your lesson and creative ways to assess whether kids have learned what you're teaching? The fourth one is methods. And we say, like, is it fun, fast, effective? These 3 things. So fun, because I just think that it is your childhood and you should be having fun in school, and you should not feel burdened by learning. Fast, because there's so much to learn. And so can you learn more effectively? This fast, I think, is especially important in our context because our kids are so far behind. We have very little instructional time. Actually, there's a lot of research on the other side to say slow learning is better. So I think that depends on context. And effective in reaching the objective that you set. And finally, partnership is the last one. Are kids partnering with the teacher and with each other in their learning? So now in Teach for India, like when fellows plan, they look at planning according to these 5 questions. When we're observing classrooms, we're also observing for evidence in these 5 questions. And then our reflection conversations also talk about them.
Lovely. Let's take a quick commercial break and I'll continue learning from you at the other end of it. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Shaheen Mistri. She's been very patient with me so far. And I want to go back to your journey with Akanksha now, from sort of the early days where, you manage a school bus, you get a bunch of your friends together and you start teaching. And that's pretty much your journey for the first 3-4 years, as you said, where the school bus is the only expense and it's going on. How does a realization come about that this needs to be something bigger in 2 ways? That one, you actually need to build an organization around it, and 2, that you also need to expand your own knowledge base and understanding of what you're doing, which is, what drove you to Manchester to actually study education. How did those realizations come about? What was your thinking in that period?
Yeah, so the image that came to mind as you shared that was every day we would go to the community to pick up our children, and the bus would be parked at the community, and our kids would get on, and then a bunch of other kids would come and hang on to the back of the bus. And I remember that image so well. And I think one day, just looking at those kids, we just said we need another center. So it was, again, I think just a heart-driven, like there's a need out there. Kids want to come. Let's try and set up another center. And so we then set up multiple centers. It got up to 60 centers. But it really just only came from there are so many kids in this community itself that need an education.
And you had a lottery system to kind of pick the lucky ones and all that you mentioned.
So the lottery system came later when we worked in schools. But when it was centers, it was literally, the first 60 kids in the community. We would go to the community to recruit. 60 kids would run up and we would take 60 kids to classrooms in each center.
And tell me about Manchester. Like, what was the purpose of, like, did you feel that you needed to do a formal course, that there were gaps in your knowledge?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not actually remembering clearly why I chose to go to Manchester. I think partly it was just that was the thing I felt I was supposed to do. Like, I needed to get a master's. I don't know how much it felt like it would solve the questions in my mind at that time, because the questions in my mind were very practical questions of running an organization. The degree I chose to do was more sort of higher level educational change, educational development in developing countries. But I think I don't think I wanted to go as well, but I think it was more, let me just get it out of the way. I remember looking for courses that were as short as possible so that I would be away for the minimum amount of time. And my friend Aarti, who I left in charge of Akanksha, I told her at that time we used to write letters. I said, every day you write letters to me with updates on how the children are doing. Twice I'll come back in between my degree to India. So it was very much more like, okay, let me go out there, get a little bit more exposure, get the stamp to be able to come back and build out the organization more.
And what was the exposure? What did you learn? Because you'd actually, in a sense, learned a lot already just by doing, just by kind of being there and facing these challenges and teaching yourself. So what additional perspectives did you get that sort of helped? Did you get some kind of broader view on how it's evolved elsewhere?
Yeah, not very much, honestly. I mean, also could be a personal style thing. I do learn much more by doing and watching people than more through theory. I think the one big thing that the degree did for me is I actually wrote my thesis, interestingly, on the role of the Indian college student in India's development. So the TFI idea actually probably was seeded a little bit in Manchester, and that came from looking around the Xavier's college canteen and seeing so many people bunking class, just sitting around doing nothing. And I would go around to all of them saying, like, aren't you like concerned about all the challenges in India? And they would all say yes. And then I would say, well, then why aren't you doing something about it? And more often than not, the response was, we don't know how we can make a difference. I think that seed like really stayed with me, that maybe all we need to do is create platforms for young people to actually make a difference, because that intention to want to make a difference is there, I think, in most of them.
And when you came back, that whole process of making Akanksha a formal organization, take me a bit through that process. Was it difficult to get it registered? Were there permissions to be got? Were there then compliances that had to be met, etc., etc.? Because from just being like a fiery college student in a cotton sari playing We Are the World and, making this initiative happen, suddenly you're in a whole different space. Like, in a sense, you're forced to do a certain kind of adulting, that you have to build an organization, you have to manage people, you have to think about fundraising, etc., etc. So take me through this period of your life.
I mean, I feel like I stayed like that college student mentality for many years into the growth of Akanksha as well. So to give you an example, first 5 years, we were all volunteers and we were going to stay like that, even though there were lots of pitfalls of working just with volunteers. But I think one day this girl came to meet me, Rachna, and I told her, if you come to volunteer, and she said, no, I think you should hire me. I think it's time for you to have like formal teachers. And so that sort of made sense. So I was like, okay. So she became our first employee. Similarly with registering, I pushed it off for as long as I could. And then beyond the bus, when we had a few other expenses, we said, okay, we need to get registered. Again, friends sort of came together. And so I think it was really the best way to describe it was one step at a time, not very strategic, responding to like the minimum that we needed to do organization wise. And I think we paid a price for that a little bit later. I think if I'd put more effort into the building blocks of the organization early on, when we started to grow, we probably would have grown a little bit more seamlessly. And at the same time, I'm sort of glad that we had that approach of just like, even with our program, it was always at the end of every year, just asking our kids, what most helped you? And refining our understanding of what children need based on that, and then adapting the program. So as our kids got older, they said, we want to earn a little bit of money. We started a sewing class. Then they said, we're struggling a bit with our parents. Then we started parents meetings. Then we said, so it was really very responsive versus more strategic, I think, the first few years at Akanksha. But there was a real intention to do right by the child and to keep the child at the center. I think that's something that stayed very present in the Akanksha culture even years after I left, that how do we really firmly keep the child at the center and design around the child?
I love the question, what most helped you? What are the other kind of answers that you got to that which helped you bridge the gap between what they needed and what you might have thought they needed?
Yeah, so interestingly, kids never responded with anything academic. The things they responded with were, my teacher was there when I needed my teacher the most. My teacher believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. English was a big one that came up. English has opened up opportunities. Exposure was a big one. We went on this field trip, that field trip. It opened up my mind to other things. Those were some of the things we heard the most. And I think the way that it made its way even more firmly into the program was, again, a emphasis on relationships being core, just because relationships matter, like not relationships for results, but just relationships overall. A focus on holistic, like could we expand the horizons of what education could look like? A focus on differentiation, that every child needs something different. That was a big piece of what we believed. Yeah.
How was it for you to kind of convert from this sort of teacher come activist almost to more of a managerial role where you now have to go and do fundraising? So you have to be a salesperson, you have to be someone who's managing people, and that is a whole different level of skill.
Yeah.
So how did wearing all of these hats, how was it for you, that journey?
Yeah. I mean, so I love doing different things and learning new things. So that's always helped me a lot. And I'm not very nervous to make mistakes and to ask for help. I have often described myself as being sort of a professional beggar, because I feel like for large parts of my life, I was just asking people for help and for different things. So I think that helped as well. But I think the activist part never really went away. I mean, I remember one of the most difficult times for me were the slum demolitions, where they would come in, and often they would come during summer vacations. So a lot of my kids were away in the village, and their houses would just get razed down without any notice. And I remember being so angry as a younger person with what was happening to kids, going to big hotels, getting food donated because they literally didn't have anywhere to cook food, bringing food to the families. So that piece was sort of a constant. I think the skill pieces, I just approached in my own way again, using I think now in retrospect, a lot of similar principles, right? Relationships, asking for help. So started with fundraising, started with family, friends, a lot of people I think gave initially feeling like, I'm doing something a little bit different than a lot of their kids are doing. Like, let me support it a little bit. It really started like that. Tried to be as resourceful as possible in early days too. So we wouldn't buy stationery. We'd go to companies and use paper that was blank on one side, make that into notebooks. So it was very, very much like startup in that sense. I think my friend who told me about the We Are the World also recounted one time when we were at the McKinsey office, and she said as we were walking out, there was a whole pile of McKinsey T-shirts, and she said, what are you doing with those T-shirts? And they said, no, those are all like, we're gonna, they're leftover T-shirts from some step back they were having, and we went and painted Akanksha on the other side, and those became the kids' T-shirts. So I think until there were 350 kids in the program, we would hand paint the Akanksha sun and Akanksha onto T-shirts. So it was not very like well thought through at all. But I think because also I had a group of friends and family around me that were interested in what I did, they supported a lot in the early days. And then slowly, as the need became bigger, the budget grew, I think I just learned the skills and picked up things from people. So I think one of the most pivotal fundraising moments for me was a conversation with someone where they said, funders really like to be able to connect to a particular project. And so why don't you break the centers down into schools and get them adopted by different companies? So simple strategies that at that time seemed like great ideas to me really worked. And then we went out and we'd ask different people to adopt a school. And then when they adopted a school, they could come in and meet the kids, and they could come and volunteer, celebrate their birthdays with kids. So the idea again of relationships between funders and the children became like one of the strategies.
Take me through, Akanksha's journey from the time you start in 89 and then in the 90s you gradually incorporate and so on and so forth. And then 2008, you're thinking of Teach for India. But take me through the period before Teach of India. Like, how is your thinking evolving on this great challenge? Like, eventually you realize that you also need to do something else and you arrive at TFI. But I want to understand how your thinking evolves through this period in terms of what are you learning? Where do you feel there are gaps? Where do you feel there are gaps that Akanksha can't fill? Where do you feel there are gaps that you can't fill? And, give me a sense of what that journey is and even how the mission of Akanksha evolves, as it were.
Yeah. So Akanksha started as after school centers. So from the initial, I would say the first phase was just one center, figuring it out, very, very scrappy. The second phase was like growing it to about 10 centers. I think still very sort of scrappy way of moving, all volunteers, etc. Then came a sort of semi-professionalizing phase. We hired our first teachers, got a little bit more money, got a little bit more professional. By that time, we were registered, of course, etc., as a formal organization. And through that entire period, I think for me, the biggest thing that those years did was, one, really show me the power of education, and they shifted my own idea of what kids were capable of. I mean, I feel like I had a high bar and I really didn't as well, because our kids kept surprising us in terms of what they could do, and not just academically, but the shifts in their mindsets, their orientation to help their families, their orientation to help their communities. So for me, that direct work in just understanding children, understanding what they were capable of, understanding the belief and the power of education, that was very, very important in the first 10 years. 10 years down the line, the last 7 years that I was at Akanksha, the model shifted. I think we gained the confidence to say, why can't we just be the school? Instead of being the after school, which had its drawbacks because kids were in a failing school, they would then come to this after school program. They were getting very different types of learning, messaging, etc. We said, can we partner with the government, use the assets of the government, use our assets, and run schools? And so that became sort of the first, what then evolved into the PPP model, where government would give us the building. We would take kids through lottery. But we would bring in our own teachers, our own school principal. Kids would, eventually have to sit for the grade 10 exam, but we had a lot of flexibility in terms of curriculum pedagogy. So we started the first Akanksha school and then kept scaling up the school model. And as kids graduated from the center model, we phased out the center model completely. So that was a really interesting phase of Akanksha where we said, okay, there's a lot of leverage in working with the system. There are resources within the system. We can also show that we can achieve different results with similar resources, with exactly the same profile of children. So the idea of creating sort of bright spots within the system, like labs of learning, while we were in turn learning from the system, became very present. And then I think in that 7 years, so I was at Akanksha totally for 17 years. In that phase, I began to think a lot about why can't this be possible for more children? And I wasn't able to see how the Akanksha model in its present form would be able to do that because it was so difficult to run, right? To run a school end to end with social workers and parents. And it was just really, really, really hard to do it. And at the same time, I was blown away by the kids and where they had reached. And I think, I spoke a little bit about it earlier, but what my kids taught me about what it means to give, what they taught me about what it means to persevere. I was just blown away by what they were able to navigate in their own lives and how with education they were actually able to overcome the circumstances of their birth and sort of be on a different life path. And so the question at that point became one of scale. And yet I was very convinced even then that scale wasn't like silver bullet incremental because I'd seen how much effort over so many years it took to get a kid to unleash their potential. And even then, how many things could go wrong. And many things went wrong with many of the Akanksha kids, despite them being on a very positive trajectory. And that inflection point led me to sort of go back 17 years down the line, look in the mirror and say, I believe in depth. I believe in education. I believe in children. What is a model that can keep those things sacred, but actually have a shot at shifting the system for many more children? And that's what led me to the Teach for India idea.
Let's talk about the Teach for India idea. Of course, you were inspired by Teach for America and everything that was happening there. Tell me a bit more about that. What is that model and why did you feel that that model was what you needed over here?
Yeah. So I think when I asked myself what is going to change the system, the idea that felt very present to me was leaders change systems. Systems do not change without leaders. And I found a model in Teach for America that believed that. There's a lot that we took from Teach for America and there's a lot that we didn't take from Teach for America. But I think that idea that if you need to change the education system, you need leadership at all levels of the system working together to shift educational inequity. That idea really made sense to me. I said, look, I don't know how to solve the problem of educational inequity. I still don't know how to solve the problem all these years later. But when you don't know how to solve something, perhaps your best chance at solving it is to get the smartest, most caring people and enough of them together and get them enthused about solving that problem. So that's the idea that we started with. And actually, my introduction to Teach for America was also very interesting because I hadn't heard of the organization and I was at Akanksha. I had no intention of leaving Akanksha as well. But 4 different Teach for America alums had volunteered at Akanksha over the course of that 17th year when I was at Akanksha. And the 4 of them didn't know each other, but I met them at 4 different times in the year. And they all were young, passionate, idealistic people that spoke a language around educational inequity that I'd never heard before. And I was fascinated. I said, at that time, I think Teach for America had about 15,000 alums. And I said, I happened to have met 4, but they're all like speaking with so much passion and conviction about children and about equity. And I said, I want to understand more about this program. And so I went to the US, tried to meet with Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, managed to meet her. That meeting didn't go very well because she was very busy with priorities in the US. I went back a month later and said, Wendy, just come to India and see whether something like this would be possible in India. And she made her first trip to India at that point. And that's sort of how we started thinking and talking about it. But it really was the idea of leadership being a powerful multiplier that was my bet. And continues. I think that's just been reaffirmed through the years.
Take me through some of the debates that you guys had, like you mentioned, sitting with your co-founder Akanksha, and the sort of debates that you had early on about, should we start big or should we do a pilot? Should it be an aspirational program or do we open it up to as many people? 1-year fellowship, 2-year fellowship, etc., etc. So take me through some of the thinking that went into the design of it, because eventually what we see from outside is what it is, what became your sort of 2009 batch, the 87 fellows, etc., etc. And the format is fixed, everything is fixed. But I'm very curious about the sort of debates that led to this form being adopted.
Yeah. So actually, you're right. I mean, the idea was originally, the seed of the idea was born in a late night conversation with Anand in my living room, actually, where I think both of us we're very passionate about this idea that young people can change nations, but we pretty much disagreed on everything else in terms of like the scope. So I think because of my Akanksha background, I was very sure that I wanted to focus on education, not because it was the only thing that was going to end poverty, but because it felt so big in and of itself that I felt if we went broader, we would not be able to have an impact in any way. I think Anand was more inspired by the AmeriCorps model, which was a broader development core base. He was also coming from having founded really India's first fellowship program, IndiaCorps, where they brought Indian Americans to India to do programs across the development sector. So I think that was one point of contention, like how narrow versus broad should this actually be? And there were several others involved at that time. Anand Piramal was a very key thought partner. Vandana Goyal, who remains in the sector, dear friend of mine over many years. So there were many of us and many stormy conversations about like how big do we start? Where do we start? Like, is there even going to be any appetite in India given cultural conditioning? Like bright young people don't go and teach in a government school, right? That's not typical. So I think those were some of the debates. I think some of the things that there was a lot of alignment on early on, which were choices. One was, even if this is the craziest thing for young people to do, let's make it highly aspirational and difficult and selective to get into. Because we really believe that. Like we believe that our nation is built in our classrooms. We believe that we need the best and brightest and most committed young people as leaders, both in our classrooms and later on in the system for the system to change. So making it selective, making it aspirational, keeping it rooted in deep experiences with children. I think that again came from my Akanksha experience, but I said I don't believe that you have the full context to advise the system as to what to do unless you've been able to shift one group of kids and been on the ground in a classroom. So that idea of the classroom being almost a microcosm of Indian society, because in a challenging classroom, you not only see the learning gap, you also see parents that are unemployed, you see health issues play out, you see abuse, you just see a range of issues in a classroom, and you understand that often it's all of those issues that get in the way of learning. And so that idea of it being immersive was a core part of the initial thinking. And also the idea of it being 2 years. And there was a lot of debate around, we thought we could attract a lot more people if it was 1 year. And I think those of us who were had worked more with kids said, is very hard to drive any change in children's lives in 1 year as a new teacher. You're just learning yourself in the first many months of the fellowship. And so if we really want to have an impact on children, then let's make sure that it's 2 years. So those were some of the initial ideas. And then where to start, what kind of schools to start in. Should we start only in government? Should we start in low-income private schools? Did a lot of visits in the early days to schools, realized that there is a pretty profound need in the government schools, but also in some of the lowest income private schools that mushroom in low income communities. So we decided to split and start across both.
I am now going to do something that might make you angry at first, which is compare you with a Republican vice president. So in the year 2000, when George W. Bush was looking for people to be vice president, the head of the search committee was Dick Cheney. And at the end of the search, he decided that there was no more suitable candidate than himself. So he became the candidate. Similarly, TFI was looking for someone to lead it. And eventually they arrived at one candidate, and you interviewed that candidate for a few hours, and everyone else was okay with the person, but something told you that this person is not right, that the vision we need is something else, and then you said, I'll do it. Take me through that process, because it would appear from the story which is in the book is that wasn't your intention at all.
Yeah.
That you were looking for a good person who would, just lead this. But you felt so deeply for it that you just felt that no, it has to be done right. And if no one else will do it, what the hell, I'll just do it. So take me through that period.
So I think this is like the persuasive power of Wendy Kopp actually in this story. So you're right. I didn't want to leave Akanksha. I'd been there for 17 years and it was just at a place where it was doing so well. And like there were so many beautiful stories of children. And I got into this work. I remain in this work for children. They give me the maximum joy still out of everything in my week. My happiest times are times directly with kids. So there was no intention of leaving Akanksha. Along with Akanksha, a group of us were sort of planning the blueprint for Teach for India. So I was getting more and more invested in the idea. And Wendy, from time to time, would tell me, look, why don't you just do it? Why don't you just do it? And I would say, no. But then I agreed to help be part of the search for the CEO of Teach for India. And it got really to a place where we were not able to find somebody and we would have lost one more recruitment cycle. And so Wendy convinced me to just do it for a year. She said, just step in because we don't want to lose one more recruitment cycle. And then you can go back to Akanksha. So I joke with my team at Akanksha that I never got a farewell because I actually left thinking that I would come back. Similar in some ways to how I left the US, I think, keeping that door open. And then I jumped in and never looked back since then.
And what was it like in the early days? Because, there were just 6 of you. It was like a startup and you're all sitting around a table and everybody's doing everything, wearing many different hats at first. So what was it like? Because I would imagine that it must be incredibly exhilarating because the other 5 would have been as passionate and driven as you. Otherwise, why would they be there? And take me through the sense of those early days before it is formed, because along with that passion and that desire, there must also be fear. There must also be so much self-doubt.
Yeah.
What was it like?
I think the best way I can describe it is we just had a lot of questions that we tried to answer. We were not able to find answers. And eventually with each one, we said, let's just jump in and try. And so the questions were like, will young people join? Right? Like, what's the value proposition for young people to do this? It's an untested idea. It's totally goes against what people say the right thing for a bright young person to do is. We had questions on like, even if they join, will they have an impact in classrooms? Because classrooms that we work in are incredibly complex to drive change in. Will they be accepted in schools? We had questions on after the 2 years, what will happen? Will they stay in the sector? I mean, the whole reason we were starting this was to build this long-term movement of leaders. But we said, like, what will keep them in the sector long-term? Will they stay? So lots and lots of questions, even before the questions of can we raise the money, will we find the team, all of the general org development questions. But I think, as you said, it was a very, very driven team. We had folks here from Teach for America, from the UK equivalent, Teach First. So we had people who had seen the power of the model in other contexts, and I think that helped a lot. And people like myself who had seen the power of education and were very driven to do it for that reason. And so we just jumped in and we said, we're not going to know if people will join unless we go out there and actually recruit. And I remember in early days standing in front of like 100 college students, thinking, probably nobody wants to do this, but I'm going to make it sound like it's the hardest thing in the world to get into. And I'm going to find that like one person who has like a small part of them, thinks that maybe this is something that they would want to do. And we would do that. We would stand up and say, there are 100 of you here. Probably 10 of you might be somewhat interested in this idea, and probably one of you is good enough. If that's you, apply. And I think, like, we didn't say that as a marketing plea. We said that because we actually believed we needed that one person. And I think that spoke to the right people. And so we were amazed. Like in our first year, I think we got about 2,500 applications, which really surprised us for, a 2-year full-time program. And then similarly with schools, I think we didn't know how to find schools. We would walk around communities, chat with kids in school uniforms, ask if they could introduce us to their schools, go and meet school principals. And we found actually like they're really open. Like there are so many empty classrooms and teacher vacancies in many schools. They were quite open. And then when we got into classrooms, we realized that's the really complex question of like, can you have impact with all of these different? And so that's where we started to think much more strategically about our training model, our support model, to say, even if we're selecting people who have a lot of raw potential, how do we really equip them to have impact? Because having impact is not just about wanting to do good. It's about actually doing good for the people that you're serving.
I really got to salute the audacity of it because, before the fact, I would have been skeptical about all of this.
Yeah.
I would have been skeptical about whether any young person would want to teach for 2 years in a random government school. What will it do for their career? It's like such an important decision to make at that stage of their lives. It's a one-way door, essentially. Why would anyone do that? Then I would question that, having taken that up, would a kid from a particular kind of, would a young man from a particular, or a woman from a particular kind of background, possibly elite, going to a government school, speaking a language which they're not familiar with, be able to make any connection at all with a bunch of students? And once again, I'd be very skeptical about being able to bridge the gap, or the percentage of time it would be bridged successfully. And yet all of it happened. Looking back, all of it happened. I have met so many Teach for India fellows, and without exception, they've all been like really impressive people. They've been outliers among that general class of their age. And I'm like, oh my God, what's going on here? So give me a little sense of the early days that when you're selecting people out of that 2,500, you whittled it down to 87, what are you selecting on the basis of? Because I would actually imagine that all 2,500 must be good because they've applied in the first place. There's a selection effect of that all of them feel committed enough to apply for this. I'd be like, my God, they're all good enough. How do you get to that 87? And then how the hell do you train them? You had a training program for them. What are the kind of learnings that you put in there? How do you train them for the challenge? Because the challenge is incredible. You've got somebody from North India going to Sikkim to teach, You've got people from all over the country going to all over the country and just teaching in places where they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know the people. All of it seems insurmountable. So take me through the ferment of those early days when it's all coming together.
Yeah. So even before selection, I think the first thing was, how do we build a brand to make people want to apply to the program? And again, we did random things. Like I walked into the Times of India, Jojo's office. I didn't know him. And I said, we have this crazy idea and I need coverage. And he gave us a full page in the Times of India to launch the program, which was insane, right? At that time, we went to Amir Khan and we said, like, it's the first institute, training institute. We need you to come. And he traveled to Pune and came and spent time with our fellows and became like one of our early brand ambassadors. So we did things to make it a little bit easier for people to apply to the program. And then with selection, so selection was really interesting because Teach for America had done a lot of research on effective teachers in classrooms. They had like years of actually systematically mapping what are the characteristics that lead to the most success with holistic student outcomes. So our initial selection model was based a lot on what they had found. And then we said we will evolve it based on our own context. We knew from the beginning that we didn't just want to look at like traditional academic achievement, because a lot of people in the system may not have the soft skills to succeed in the program. So we looked at things like building relationships and investing people. We looked at, levels of humility and respect that people had. So there were soft skills we looked at, as well as demonstrated leadership achievement, which could have been academic excellence. It could have been excellence in sportsmanship or in another dimension of your life. And from the beginning, the selection process was very rigorous. So you had to do a written application. You then got a phone interview. You then came and met us in person for an all-day assessment center where you did a one-on-one interview. You did a group discussion. So it was a very intensive process as well, not just for us to get to know the candidate, but for the candidate to get to know Teach for India. And then we kept it very selective. So year on year, we've selected between 5 and 8% of people that applied to the program consistently. So we've managed to keep it really selective. The training has actually been the most complex part of what we do. And so after fellows get selected, they first come to a residential 6-week training program that we've sort of evolved and innovated on over the years. But that's sort of like a boot camp. And when you said, some of us, when we started Teach for India, all idealistic, you need to come to Institute to actually feel what a revolution feels like, because there are today like hundreds of young people together who want to build like just a better, safer, kinder world for all of us. They come together and that energy is really infectious. So all the fellows come together. We do a 6-week boot camp. They learn the basics of teaching. They spend time in community. They understand a little bit about what it means to connect with children. They learn a little bit of content. They basically are trained to become day one ready teachers. But then the training and support model continues through the whole 2 years. So you become a full-time teacher for 2 years, but you also have someone who's in your classroom coaching you every 2 weeks. You also have content circles, pedagogy circles, spaces to come together. So it's a pretty elaborate and rigorous training and selection model that goes across the 2 years.
Tell me about values across 2 dimensions. Like one dimension is the values of your organization itself, that what are the values within TFI that you want to put to the forefront, and 2, at a broader level, what are the values you want to teach? Like you've spoken about, the 6 core values that you came up with. So what were they and how did they evolve and change with time?
Yeah. So our values are called Rise with Love, which is an acronym that one of our board members came up with. I remember how excited everyone was. Everyone's going to remember the values now because it's just Rise with Love. But R stands for reflection. And actually these values evolved because of what we saw happening organically across the organization. So reflection was something that we just felt in education, especially whether you're learning as a fellow or as a student. The idea to make sense of what you're going through and to pause makes so much sense. So reflection, we have multiple practices for reflection. The I in Rise stands for integrity, which, every day are you, how often are your thoughts, your words, and your actions aligned, and where are they not, and how can you learn to become more and more aware of that, and also be gentle with yourself, because there's so many times when they're not in alignment each day for all of us. The third was sense of possibility, and that came from like what we're trying to do is a little bit crazy. We're going to need a lot of idealism, a lot of optimism to navigate through the inevitable challenges that come. The sense of possibility with an individual child who perhaps people have given up on. Maybe the child has given up on himself or herself as well, but also the sense of possibility for what education can be, how it can shape the nation. The fourth one is excellence. Like, we believed that there was a lot happening in the country, and a lot of what was happening was mediocre and not excellent. And that was sort of like okay because the demand was so huge in the country. We said we want to strive for excellence, not see excellence as a destination, but the pursuit of doing what we do with depth and with quality. And finally, rise with love. Love was the most important of our values, to say, like, let's do all of this out of love for the child. And because we believe that, like, love is the most important thing that we can give to the country and to the world. So those are the main values that we anchor on. And we've found over time more and more ways to embed them as actions into everything. So right from like the way that we hire people at Teach for India, we hire for values, to our performance appraisals are not just about the outcomes and goals, but they're also about the journey of values, like, which values most enabled us to reach our goals, which values didn't. And then, of course, the trickle down into classrooms. In our classrooms, we've actually codified, we call them the 8 C's, and we've made them into 8 little characters, but we've looked at like what are the values / mindsets that children need the most based on our best evolving understanding to be successful in an ever-changing and rapidly changing world. And so some of those are the more predictable 21st century skills that are very well researched and documented, right? Creativity, communication, collaboration, critical thinking. But some of those are things that we felt were less spoken about, and we felt the world and the country needed them a lot. So those were courage, compassion, consciousness. And so those make up sort of the 8 C's, and we codify them, we make them into stories, into songs, into poems to bring them into our classrooms. And because they all start with C, and they've all been made into sort of like inspired by the Mr. Men series little characters, they've actually seeped into the fabric of our classrooms really seamlessly.
And it would seem to me that early on, especially for the young fellows going out there to teach, there would have been an inevitable culture clash right at the start. Like, you've got this beautiful para I'll read out about one of your fellows, Anasuya. And the para goes, for months after the first day, Anasuya's class continued to be violent. Each day included brutal fights, pencil stabbings, and kids bleeding. Her students would bring little stones to school to fling at each other. One day, just for fun, they poured water on her iPad. They drink alcohol, smoke, and watch pornography. All of this was common in their community. Students would witness incidents that included a 3-month-old baby being flung off the high terrace of a building only because she was a girl. They'd see a woman set on fire in a dowry crime. Stop quote. How hard was it for that initial batch, for example, and I guess it would have been the hardest for them, to actually be able to deal with this? Like, how would you prepare for them to deal with this, not with repulsion or despondence or frustration or anger, but taking that step back and having the wider maturity that I've got to give it time, I've got to figure out how to make this work? How was that process? And then how much of it would filter back to you, and how would at one level removed from all of this, how would you then deal with this?
Yeah, so there's something really amazing about a first cohort in general, I think, and we call them the Niners. But one is that I think they genuinely were mavericks, right? So they joined when there was no proof of concept. It was a crazy idea. So they came in with a level of like self-drive and a willingness to embrace all that came at them, which I think was, has been present, of course, in subsequent cohorts, but was especially difficult for them because they were the first cohort. So I think that was one. I think the second is there was no line between fellows and staff at that time, because actually the questions you're asking were things that all of us were struggling with, and we didn't have answers. And I think there was a very beautiful culture in the organization of just dialogue. Like when we may not have answers, but can we talk to each other about how we're processing this, what we can do, what the value sometimes in a child's life is of just listening, even if you can't solve, what it means to what you can change and also what you can't change, and learn to be okay with that. So I think the value of reflection, the structure of dialogue and meaning making helped a lot. Having said that, those challenges continue to throw us off even today, and continue to throw me off. Like when people ask me, what have your biggest challenges been? Even though, yes, like working with the system, fundraising, these are all challenges. I don't want to undermine them, but I never put those first. I always say the emotional complexity of dealing with children who are struggling with hardship. When you fall in love with those kids and they're your kids and you know what they're going through, the learning how to navigate what you can and how to be okay with the helplessness when you can't, that is the most difficult. So I think it was difficult then. I think it remains difficult today. I think over time, we have many more partnerships with other organizations to be able to help. In those days, we didn't. So there was a lot more dependence just on the group trying to co-create solutions and ways forward.
And what does it do to you, and what did it do to them, in the sense that it must be so emotionally grueling? And I imagine that you grow a lot, through all of this. You learn to see a world that is much bigger than yourself. You surely learn humility. You learn empathy. I mean, you're forced into empathy in a sense, but you just look at the world very differently. You go in one person, you come out the other person. I'm sure that happened to you in a different way over an extended period of time through the Akanksha experience and so on. And I'm sure it happened to these guys. So what do you see? What does it do to them? Because in one sense, you said that the point of this is not just the proximate aim of educating these kids, but it is also the larger aim of building leaders for the future.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think this for me was one of the biggest shifts for me, because as I said, I got into this for children, and at one point in my career many years ago, I almost saw people as an impediment, they were just tools to be able to achieve what we wanted to with kids. And I think TFI helped show me that the change in children is so important and precious, but the shifts in adults who then take that combination of anger and hope that they've experienced in the 2 years forward beyond the 2 years is really profound. So, I mean, I think it's a very hard question, because I think for each of them, they've taken different things from the fellowship, but some of the common things that I've seen, one is just an opening of their eyes, right? Like you mentioned earlier, it's very easy, even within cities where Mumbai has a lot of poverty, and yet you can get through most of your life without seeing it. And so understanding why that child is falling asleep in class, and, why that child is not learning, and knowing that it's not because the child is lazy or the child doesn't care about education, but because of something much more deep rooted. So that being able to see the complexities of poverty in India, even though it's at a superficial level, it's just 2 years, there's a lot more to learn beyond. I think that was one of the biggest things that the fellowship has done. I think the second has been the ability to see change. And I remember one of my early fellows, 2010, Avantika, she was a news anchor for 10 years and chose to do the fellowship. And I remember when she first at summer school at our training institute met her kids, she came back like sobbing. She said, like, you sort of tricked us and cheated us, and there's no way that the gap can be bridged. It's just too crazy. And she was teaching a grade 2 class in Delhi. And when she started, her kids were not able to read simple words. They were not able to speak any English at all. She was very ambitious. By the middle of grade 3, when I went to visit her classroom, her kids were reading a grade 6 text, the unabridged version of Oliver Twist, and literally like sitting at the edge of their seats, about to fall off their seats. They were so excited to be learning. When you see that kind of change is possible, I think what it gives you is that belief that you can do anything. Like, it seemed impossible and it's possible. I think that's the second. I think the third shift is actually from like feeling like we're saviors, like we're parachuting in from these like great colleges or corporates into schools to sort of save the system, to realizing that like you totally have got it wrong. It's not about that at all. And so like the shift to being more humble, understanding how much you can learn from children, from other teachers in the system, from the system, like understanding why people's actions become the way that they do, how like systems have failed people versus people failing us. I think that has been a third big one. I mean, I could go on and on, but like very, very profound learnings. And I think shifts in some of these skills and values is another one. Like our model is called teaching as leadership, because we really believe that what great teachers do and what great leaders do is one and the same, right? A great teacher will come into a class, set a vision, often that the kids have never had before. They will then plan towards that vision. But the job of planning for a teacher is more complex than any planning job, because you're planning for 40 kids all at different levels, different ways of learning. They'll then figure out how to execute in creative, fun, effective ways, which again is very difficult because you're executing for kids that learn in very different ways. You then learn how to reflect on your practice, how to ask, even though you're putting in so much effort, what could I have done better every day? So I think you learn skills, mindsets, and orientations of long-term leadership that actually are translatable in anything that you do.
There's this great quote by Sahil Bloom about the difference between planning and preparation. And planning assumes that there will be order, and preparation assumes that there will be chaos.
Yeah.
And I guess here it's really a matter of preparation, which is, and of course you do prepare all of your fellows, as it were. My next question is about a journey that I guess you must that you took with Akanksha and then you took with TFI again, and that journey is a shift from the immediate thing that you're doing to a kind of higher order thinking about it, from the tactical imperative to the strategic vision, you know, from the daily firefighting to actually sitting back and doing the planning and preparation for the future. So what was that like in the case of TFI, you know, that you are, of course, starting with a strategic vision that will build leaders and we'll do this and we'll do that. But how did that evolve over a period of time, especially when the difficulty of the task became apparent? Like, how many of your fellows stayed within the ecosystem, which was, you know, part of your intention, or even, you know, allied adjacent fields like policy making or whatever? How many of them stayed within it and in what you've seen in the, you know, 15 years since? You know, what is your sense of, you know, are you where you would have wanted to be in 2009? Are you beyond that? Or has the way you look at it changed completely?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I am where I wanted to be. I think I accept where I am, and I'm very, very conscious that it is a drop in the ocean compared to what is needed. But I'm also like really happy with that drop. Like I feel very, very blessed to be able to do this work. I think I've seen shifts and impact on multiple levels. I mean, the biggest and most beautiful are our children. I think we have kids today studying all over the world. We have 50 of our own students who've come back and joined the fellowship as teachers now, completing the circle. My own daughter is doing the fellowship now. So like we've seen a lot of beautiful things happen with children. I think I've also seen, like what we spoke about a little bit earlier, like very profound shifts with the fellows themselves, their orientation, people coming in thinking like, I'm going to do this for 2 years and then go join the corporate sector who, 15 years later are living in communities, running a community center or working with the government, still focused on education. So I think those shifts have happened. I think the big number that we've most cared about is again the leadership pipeline because of the multiplier for systemic change for children. And there, 71% of our 5,000 fellow alumni have stayed in education and the development sector. And our goal was to have between 60 and 70% stay. We believe that it's important for some to go back into corporate mainstream because that also needs to shift for education to shift. But that makes me really proud. I mean, and today I just run into TFI alums everywhere. Like yesterday, I was in a meeting with one of our alums, Safdar, who started an organization called Lighthouse, where they train kids in filmmaking and storytelling so that they can raise their voice. In that same meeting, another alum was there. Her name is Shivani. She started something in Udaipur called The Third Space. And her concept is so beautiful. It's 100,000 square foot building for people of all walks in life in Udaipur to come and interact and learn together. And so I mean, every week I am meeting the most incredible alumni. And I think that's where you see the multiplier. Like for 2 years of the fellowship, they are focusing on their 30 students and going deep and learning and creating impact for those kids. But then as alumni, either they're going deeper or they're going much broader and working at scale. And so today alums are working across 23 state governments. They've started 160 organizations in the sector. And you really see then the multiplier and the ripple. And my big excitement is that now our kids are getting to that stage where they are going to be at the forefront of the movement. And I truly believe like Teach for India will be led and guided by students that were one day in our classrooms leading the movement over time.
Absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, I think even you can never truly know the difference that you made just by seeding all of these people and by creating these leaders, as you say. Here's a difficult question. Over the time span that this has been playing out, India has changed. Our society has changed. Our politics has changed. The way people learn has changed. The sort of information we are inundated with, the kind of narrative warfare that happens around us, all of that has changed. How does that impact the world? Because, at one level, it's a glorious thing that we have the internet and all of human knowledge is available to us. But at another level, like I think Jonathan Haidt once pointed out, everything that you consume in a particular day was like 90% of what you produce in a particular day was created in the last 3 days. There's an immediacy to it, and there's a danger that algorithms lead you into particular silos from which you don't emerge. I often have this thought experiment of a 15-year-old kid who, goes to YouTube for the first time, and a friend has sent him a video of a particular sort, and he sees that one video, and then the algorithm suggests similar videos to him, and then he's in that echo chamber, and that's the only world he knows. You were earlier talking about how you once went to a classroom somewhere of mainly Hindu students and found that most of them hadn't heard of Eid, which to me is just mind-blowing to not have heard of it. Or I think in one of the books there was some mention of how there are tons of kids in a particular place who hadn't heard of Gandhi.
Yeah.
And again, that is mind-blowing. People of our generation, we are more or less the same age. People of our generation, there's a shared bedrock of knowledge and cultural understanding that we have. And there's a huge danger that is simply missing and the country's turned into something else when we weren't looking. What have you seen of this among the students that you teach, in the classrooms that, you've encountered? And how can you mitigate some of it in terms of adjusting the values that you teach? I mean, elsewhere you spoke about the importance of constitutional values and, pushing them through as well, not in a partisan kind of way, but
Yeah.
values as values,
Yeah.
they're universal.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this? What are your experiences?
Yeah. So I mean, thank you for this question. I mean, I think when people today ask me like why I do what I do, I really think that this is the reason. The idea that like we need to like build and live by human values that make the world better for all of us. Like, I think that is the work of education. I certainly think that's my mandate as someone leading this organization. To me, the very idea of India, is the idea enshrined in the preamble of our constitution, right? That equality, liberty, fraternity, justice, not just for me, but for all. When we talk about a safe space to raise our voice, it's not just the ability that I have to raise my voice, but the ability I have to hold space for you as well. So I have a very strong sort of personal belief in that. And I do think that our nation gets shaped in our homes and in our classrooms predominantly. Like we can't control what happens in individual homes, but we can certainly make the institution of school an institution where kids deeply understand what these ideas mean and what they look like, and make classrooms a space where we practice that, right? Liberty in grade 2 may look like me having the confidence to raise my hand when I don't know the answer to a question and trying and being encouraged to try. And liberty in grade 7 may look like me standing up if a child is getting bullied in my school. So I feel like Teach for India and our community believes very strongly that all people in our country are equal. There needs to be justice for everybody. There needs to be freedom for everybody. And I think fraternity, especially with children, is so important. How do you foster friendships through people listening? One of my most beautiful examples is a small innovation that one of our fellows used to do called a Guftagu Circle. And he would get a group of people in the school together every 2 weeks, but it would be a very diverse group. So the day that I went there was a grandmother from the community, a community leader, the school principal, the lady who swept the floors of the school, a second standard child. They were all sitting together. And it was a very simple format. Each person just shared a part of their story. And at one point, the lady who swept the floors, she looked at the principal of the school and she said, I have been given 6 job offers that offer me more money than sweeping the floors of this school. But I will not leave this school because here you know my name and here people look in my eyes. And the school principal was in tears, I think, never realizing that small act of treating someone with dignity as a human being made such a big difference. To me, that is the work. Do I worry that is breaking down in the country? I think I'm seeing increasing examples in our own smallish world of TFI of where that is breaking down, where people are less willing to entertain a different value, to celebrate a different festival, to value somebody who's different. And I think the opportunity for us in education is to say we make a better world for every single person in this country if we actually understand what these values mean and we learn how to live them.
When I asked you earlier about thinking of the vision that you had in 2009, are you kind of, how do you feel about today? I sensed a note of disappointment that, hey, not quite, but I've sort of adjusted to the new reality and so on. What have you learned through this journey of TFI? Like, what is it that makes you proud? And I think I already kind of know, and you've hinted at all of that. What is it that makes you proud, and what is it that makes you worry? What is it that is really a disappointment? And
yeah, I think my biggest worry is just the forces that feel somewhat out of our control, that are giving our children messages that feel more like self-serving, like messages that reinforce the need to compete, the need to be first, the need to like earn the maximum that I can for myself, accrue the maximum resources that I can for myself. I feel like the voice that's saying, wait a minute, there's an other in our life as well. There's an and between me and other. There is a we. In our last musical, the sort of crowning message of the musical was, if you look at the letters of India, INDIA, and if you rearrange them, you of course see an I in India, but you also see an and in India. There's an I, AND-I, an I and I. That and feels less present. I think in earlier generations, it was the moral science class that there was some attempt to say, like, value the other. And I think today that feels less present. I think the walls between people feel higher and harder to break down. And of course, like what social media does and doesn't do, what AI will do and is already doing, those also feel like forces that are difficult to understand. I think it feels harder to share an opinion that may not sit well with people, even though you're sharing it legitimately as one opinion with a lot of openness to hearing a different opinion. So I think those pieces feel very different today than when we started. I also think that when we started, rightly or wrongly, there was more of a like, just do whatever it takes for children. We were able to say that more emphatically to young people. I think today, with the well-being movement being so much more present, and importantly so, with what especially is happening with mental health, etc., and anxiety in the country, I think, again, perhaps we're shifting a little bit more towards self and less towards like service and others. So that remains something that I'm trying to think a lot more about how that's going to impact Teach for India and our work. I think the things I feel good about, one is I think we're putting a generation of children out there who know themselves better, know what they want better, are more willing to raise their voices and know how to express themselves. That feels really important. I think our fellows as alumni are really doing good work, but also are good people. I find often when I talk about them, what is foremost in my mind is not like actually what they're doing, but who they are. And there are just so many incredible examples out there of people who are putting others at the same space as where they are, if not ahead of who they are. And I think that feels really beautiful. I also have a lot of belief in collective action, and I'm seeing that happen more and more. And that's really exciting, not just within Teach for India, but within the sector overall. I think the pandemic did very good things for us in that regard, brought people together. I think many of us let go of a lot of our convictions to say, no, working together, supporting each other, that really matters. And so seeing more evidence of collective action as well. And a lot of good things in education that I think in 2009 were much less, it was harder to find those examples. Today, there are so many schools trying to reinvent, trying to reimagine, showing us different ways that learning can happen. So that feels very exciting as well.
Tell me about the role that the arts have played in both pedagogy and the community, because you've spoken about all the musical plays that you've done with the kids. You've had them work with artists and create art and even sold it at auction, etc., etc.
Yeah,
because it seems to me that if there are these divisions in the abstract, they can be bridged somewhat by doing things in the concrete, like making music together, doing plays together, etc., etc.
Yeah. So for me, my journey with art started at Akanksha, where we just started a visual arts program for our kids. And we had no idea how powerful it would be in shifting our kids' sense of like confidence, imagination, self esteem. It was just phenomenal. So it became a big part of our work at Akanksha. And that's where I also started my work on performing arts and musicals with children. And so that has sort of like organically flowed into Teach for India. I think there's so many things, but I'll choose two things that I think have been very powerful about the arts. One is we found that children that have gone through intensive journeys with the arts have just fundamentally different outcomes than our other kids, including academically, even if the project wasn't linked to academics. So that's been sort of fascinating that like what they've got from the arts for how it's shifted their lives is just phenomenal. We did a play a few years ago called The Greatest Show on Earth, which was a parody of the education system, where our kids told their lived experiences of their education system and then chose a circus character, like the circus pretends to be the greatest show on earth, but actually isn't. The education system is sort of the promise of dreams, hope, magic, but actually it isn't. From that group of 20 students that engaged in that process, 8 of them today are teachers that teach for India. So, it's amazing the kind of impact that the arts can have on the individual children that go through it. But I think for me, the bigger purpose has been, I think people listen to messages through the arts in a way that they don't listen to messages in many other ways. And so for us, whether it's like what we were just talking about, the need to build constitutional values in kids, our last musical was called The Conference of the Birds, and it was about a group of children in search of the idea of India. I think if we had told even our own community that we want to build these values in kids, like it would have sort of gone over people's heads. But seeing it through a powerful show where you've seen the transformation of children, their understanding of this, and it's broadcast in a way that feels sticky and magical, there is a way to advocate through the arts that I think is very difficult to advocate for in any other way. So for me, each musical has had like a theme or a big idea we've wanted to advocate for. In our original Maya musical, it was the idea of student leadership, that kids can lead change. They're not change makers in the future, they're change makers today. Can we make that happen today? With The Greatest Show, it was about our role as kids in the education system. With Conference of the Birds, it was about this idea that our nation is built in our classroom. So I think advocacy has been the most powerful manifestation of the arts. And I'm also really thrilled that so many of our alumni today have organizations that are advancing the arts. So beautiful alumni organization called Nazariya, which is building storytelling through zines and filmmaking, where the idea is every kid can be a storyteller. A big organization called Slam Out Loud, where, she found that kids in her class were not able to express themselves. She introduced them to spoken word poetry. And today that's like a huge organization working across the country on just expression and voice for children. So as a platform for voice, expression, advocacy, I think it's very beautiful. Also, it's just so much fun for kids. I think, when people sometimes ask me what's the most difficult thing you've done in your career, I often, when jokes apart, say it is putting on a musical, because you never know how there's so many parts that need to come together to create something larger than life. And that's not easy to do. I think when you work on a project like that, you're able to apply those learnings to so many other dimensions of what you do.
I couldn't agree more that art can be transformative. And when I think about the why of that, two possible explanations come to mind. And one simply is that, hey, it ain't necessarily so. What simply happens is that there's a selection effect, and the kind of person likely to volunteer for taking part in a musical play or whatever is already a different kind of person. So the causality may be the other way. But the more optimistic part of me thinks that no, once you volunteer, art can just change everyone, because it is bringing out those creative collaborative faculties. It is building teamwork because you have to work with others. You are helping, you are asking for help. It just changes you entirely. And I'm more drawn to the second explanation,
Yeah.
perhaps because of wishful thinking. But, and is that your experience as well?
I mean, I can give you a very real example, because with Conference of the Birds, we decided to do something very different. We said, like most musicals, you'll audition kids, you'll take the most talented kids. We said, let's do the opposite. Let's work with a group of kids. We'd just come out of the pandemic. They had been out of school for 2 years. They were not able to read and write. They were not able to speak any English. They had no exposure to the arts. We literally said the only criteria is you have to be willing to come. And we took those kids, and early days, kids would fight. They didn't sit next to each other. There was religious intolerance in the class. Like, it was really, really, I mean, I at many points said, what have we got ourselves into? And we said, let's put them through a 2-year journey in pursuit of putting on this musical. And so we worked with them over 2 years. And it is phenomenal what happened. These same children were able to, perform in front of an audience of thousands across 3 cities, a 90-page English, hip-hop, Sufi-inspired script. They sang, they danced. Most importantly, they really learned what these 4 values in our Constitution meant through lived practice of them day after day. So I think it's possible with all kids, and I think it needs to be a much bigger part of the education system.
Absolutely mind-blowing. My penultimate question, tell me a little bit about what it is to run a non-profit. These are beautiful things that you've done. You've built Akanksha, you've built TFI, incredible achievements in every way. But what people often don't see is what goes into the making of the sausage, right? What is it like, especially in these changing times, to actually run a non-profit? We've discussed earlier about all the different challenges of management and fundraising, and you have modestly called yourself a professional beggar and said, hey, you like to learn new things and play different roles, so you've kind of managed. But what is it actually like? Because, plenty of people get drawn to the idea of doing good and this way or that way, but actually when you get down to it, it's bloody tough. Give me a sense of how has it been for you? What do you feel?
I mean, again, I feel lucky because I managed to spend a lot of my time doing the things that I still love, which I feel very lucky about. So within running an organization, anything to do with program, anything to do with ideas, these are all strategy. These are all things that I love. And I've been very blessed to be able to still spend a lot of my time on those aspects. I think the aspects that have been more challenging are the aspects to do with governance, compliance, fundraising continues to be a challenge. I mean, it's just a difficult environment to raise money. There's a lot of reporting, a lot of compliance, a lot of governance regulations, much more than when I started. And I think the other really complex thing is just people management. I have learned over time to love working with people. That was a really long journey for me. I was a very impatient, angry manager, and it's taken me a long time to really say that the best part of my work is working with my team. I love my team today. But that doesn't mean it's easy. I think, it's actually much easier to work on something yourself, I think, than to work through and with people. And so people complexities and learning how complex human beings are and how much of their actions at work have nothing to do with work and have to do with who they are and the challenges they are facing in their own lives and their own insecurities and, the charisma that you have with them and where your style and their style don't match. And I think working with people is just really challenging. I think the other thing that I found challenging but greatly rewarding is building culture. I think many years ago, I just started to really believe that great organizations are just great culture, and you may not see it in good times, but when an org goes through a bad time, that's where you really see the culture of an organization shine through. And so the consistency. I'm not a very consistent person, and that's been a challenge for me, but trying to be as consistent as possible with practices of building culture, building relationships, investing in things in a non-transactional way, even if there are pressures from outside to be transactional, because, you need resources or you need people, but reminding yourself that no, like the work is purer than that. It's more beautiful than that. It is, what you do today is going to impact the world 10,000 years from now, not just tomorrow. And how do you keep that mindset of abundance? I think the challenging times for me have been when I've lapsed into scarcity as a mindset. There isn't enough money, there isn't enough, I'm not going to find this person. But then as soon as I remind myself, no, like the world is abundant, like nature teaches us that every day, right? And I think when I'm able to hold that abundant mindset, like the challenges don't go away, but I'm able to deal with them in a very different way.
I think the one kind of scarcity that we can't do anything about, and one way in which nature is not so abundant after all, is time.
Yeah.
That, we can solve scarcities of money and attention and all of these things, but ultimately the time kind of catches up. And how has that changed you? How has the passage of time changed you? Like once you were 18 and you just had that sense that, hey, I want to do something good in the world, and you just went out and did it.
Yeah.
And then over time, your time horizons might be different. Your need for immediate gratification might change over time. You realize you're playing the long game. But, as Keynes might well have said, in the long game, we are all dead.
Yeah.
So, how has time changed you sitting here now in your 50s? How do you feel about pace of the world, the arc of change, the way you look at your own life, the things that make you happy?
Yeah. These are all questions for a whole 5-hour podcast. But relationship with time, I think I used to believe a lot more in urgency and pace. I still believe a little bit in urgency in the short term, but I think I've cultivated the fact that like this is a long game. Like you need to also cultivate patience for the long term. And so how do you balance, like how can I be as effective as I can in this moment with how can I have like the staying power, build the muscle to be creating impact again, like beyond me, or impact that I may never be able to see. I think one of the big shifts for me has been, and now I think of time less in sort of a linear way and more in terms of like moments that matter. And so I sort of like end each year looking back and saying like the only thing that really matters is like how many moments are special to me. And they could be special, could be defined as like navigating a challenge. It could be a high, it could be a moment of joy, but like, can I be as present as I can in the moment? And when I'm able to be present, and this is all an ongoing like pursuit, but those moments when I'm able to be present, I think are the moments that feel most like magical to me. And then if you can like collect enough moments, then even in your more difficult times, you're able to go back and like hold on to those moments. So I've started thinking a lot about that concept of just moments being the only thing that really matters.
And do you think you can increase the likelihood of those moments with mindfulness or intentionality?
I think so, for sure. I think a lot of staying in the work is actually more like the internal shifts and work than anything outside. I was telling people that I feel I have more responsibility today than I've ever had, and I feel less responsible, which is all just an internal shift. It's like today I genuinely believe that there's like the whole team is there with me. Like, it's like we're all there together, and we will do what we can do, and that's enough. And I would not have been able to say that earlier. And so I think some of these shifts for me have happened through mindfulness, but also through people. Like I was sharing a little bit earlier with you, I stumbled into an ecosystem in Ahmedabad about 25 years ago, where at that time I was very disoriented because I believed in results and in like ambition and big things. And these people were saying the opposite. They were like, no, small things matter. It's the internal work that matters. Let go of results. Focus on what you're doing. And I was really like visibly like disturbed by it. And then somehow I've just gone back to that ecosystem year after year. And I've been very drawn to people that I think have made those shifts inside themselves. And so today I feel like I'm a lot more gentle with myself. It's helped me be a lot more gentle with people outside. And counterintuitively, I think it's made me more effective, not less effective. I think the fear as a younger person was, unless you're urgent, impatient, you're not going to have the results. But I've actually found that, no, actually, if you slow down, if you pause, if you're more gentle, if you're more joyful, like actually, then you bring more joy to your work. And to me today, the energy and the joy that I bring feels like a really important contribution.
So I'm going to ask you sort of a two-part question, which you may have to take a few moments to think about and answer, which is, if you had one thing to say to the 18-year-old Shaheen, what would you say? And if she could look at you through the same time machine and say one thing to you, what would she say?
These one thing questions are very difficult.
It could be two things. It could be three things.
I think I would have helped the 18-year-old Shaheen understand love more. I think I was very driven by anger, by injustice, by right and wrong, by black and white. I think an understanding that the world is more complex, it's much more nuanced than that. It's much more gray, and people are good. They just, all of us, like we just lose our way. We're not the sum of our lowest moments. My dear board member and mentor, Anu, shared something very beautiful with me once. She said, in moments where you're feeling like very proud and like you've done something extraordinary, she said, make sure you pull yourself back to earth and remind yourself that you're ordinary. But then when you're ordinary for too long, make sure that someone around you kicks you and reminds you that you're extraordinary. And can you, like that interplay of ordinary, extraordinary, the grays in the world, like just seeking to understand more deeply out of a space of like love for others and for yourself. Yeah, I think that's what I would have told my 18-year-old self. What my 18-year-old self should be telling me today is like, don't think so much. I think I've become like more risk averse, more nervous about how the world will respond to my views, what I can say and not say. I think my 18-year-old self didn't care. It was like, just like live life more. And my nani also, going back to her one last time, I think she really didn't care what the world thought of her. And I think she was one of the most free people that I have ever, in my own life, that I've ever experienced. So I would want my 18-year-old self to tell me to be free, like truly free, like understand what freedom is and live that way.
Beautiful. My final question for you, for me and my listeners, recommend to us works of art, books, films, music that you absolutely love and you love so much you want to share with everyone.
One thought that comes to mind as you say that is I find a lot of the most profound lessons in children's books. And so I would recommend go to the children's section of a bookstore. There's a beautiful bookstore in Mumbai, Kahani Tree, that I have started going back to more regularly, and look at some of the most beautiful children's books. One that I can recommend from last week that I just discovered is a book that's called What Your Feelings Do When No One Is Looking. And my favorite page in the book is love when no one's looking is an electrician. And there's a picture of this little character lighting up a big bulb. And I thought about that and I was like, that's so beautiful because electricians bring light to the world. And of course, the famous proverb, where there is love, there is light. And then the association of light with knowledge and potential. So I think I have drawn a lot of inspiration from children's books and children's poetry, in addition to a wide range of other things.
Any perennial favorites?
The book that I read the most as a child 14 times was Charlotte's Web, because I think I was very obsessed with animals and compassion. The book I read to our fellows every year on day one is Dr. Seuss's Oh, the Places You'll Go, which I think has like profound truths about the roller coaster of life. And then other books I don't reread and go back to, but a wide range of fiction mainly. I love, I think my favorite genre of books are magic realism, just that way of living in the world where you're able to see the truth, but you're also able to lose the truth and lose yourself in your imagination. That feels very present for me.
Shaheen, thank you. This was a reality check, this episode, but it was also magical. So I think we meet all the criteria. So thank you so much for spending so much time.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. Check out Teach for India also. It's linked from the show notes. And if you want to volunteer, hey, please do apply. Shaheen doesn't seem to be on Twitter, which is perhaps a sign of why she is so productive. But I'm on Twitter and you can find me there at Amit Varma, AmitVarma. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.